During my paternal grandmother's funeral, her lawyer quietly took me aside and said, "Miss, you need to see something right away." Then he cautiously added, "Do not let your parents or your younger brother know." But the second I arrived and saw the person waiting behind the dark basement door, I froze in absolute shock. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and treated you like an outsider. My name is Madeline. I am 32 years old and working as a forensic accountant, and somehow I am still healing from wounds my own family inflicted. As a professional who spends her days tracking hidden assets and uncovering financial fraud, I escape their daily toxicity by burying myself in spreadsheets and audit reports. But the sudden passing of my beloved grandmother brought me right back into the center of their destructive orbit. The morning of the funeral, the sky over Boston was a heavy, oppressive gray. Rain lashed against the towering stained glass windows of the historic cathedral, creating a solemn rhythm that mirrored the hollow ache in my chest. This was a high society gathering. My family was deeply entrenched in the local elite, and the pews were packed with wealthy business owners, local politicians, and socialites who came to pay their respects, and more importantly, to be seen paying their respects. I sat near the front row wearing a simple, modest black dress that contrasted sharply with the extravagant mourning attire of my relatives. My mother, Patricia, sat 2 seats away, wrapped in an expensive dark wool coat, with a dramatic black veil pinned to her hair. She dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, playing the role of the devastated daughter-in-law to absolute perfection. Next to her sat my father, Richard, whose posture was stiff and unyielding, projecting the image of a strong, stoic patriarch holding his family together. And then there was Cameron, my 28-year-old younger brother, the undisputed golden child of the family. He wore a custom-tailored black suit and a luxury watch that caught the dim light of the church every time he adjusted his cuffs. Cameron had recently appointed himself as the CEO of a tech startup, a title my parents financed and endlessly bragged about to their affluent friends. He sat there with a smug, complacent expression, occasionally leaning over to shake a hand or accept a quiet condolence from a passing millionaire as if he were the sole heir to my grandmother's sprawling legacy. My grandmother was the only person in this family who ever saw me for who I truly was. While my parents poured all their resources and affection into Cameron, she was the one who encouraged my analytical mind. She paid for my accounting textbooks when my father refused to support any career path that did not involve his own corporate empire. She was my sanctuary. Before she passed, she explicitly asked me to deliver her eulogy. She wanted me to share the real stories of her life, not the sterilized, corporate-friendly version my parents had prepared for the printed programs. As the priest concluded his opening prayer, he gestured toward the front pew, announcing that the granddaughter of the deceased would now share a few words. I took a deep breath, clutching the neatly folded pages of my speech in my trembling hands. I stood up, feeling the collective weight of hundreds of eyes shifting to focus on me. I stepped out of the pew and began the short walk toward the wooden podium. I did not make it past the altar steps. Before I could even reach the microphone, my mother, Patricia, sprang from her seat with terrifying speed. To the rest of the congregation, it looked like an act of overwhelming maternal grief. She rushed forward, wrapping her arms around me, in what appeared to be a desperate, emotional embrace. A low, sympathetic murmur rippled through the crowd as they watched a mother seemingly comforting her heartbroken daughter. But there was no comfort in her grip. Her perfectly manicured fingers dug into my upper arms like steel claws, pinning me in place. She pulled me close, pressing her cheek against mine so that only I could hear the venom dripping from her words. "Do not embarrass this family further," she hissed into my ear, her voice a low, vicious razor blade cutting through the ambient noise of the church. "A bankrupt, divorced failure like you has no right to stand before these people. Go sit down before you ruin everything." The words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I froze my lungs, refusing to expand. I tried to pull away to step toward the podium, but her grip tightened until I felt my skin bruise beneath the fabric of my dress. She maintained her tragic smile for the audience, gently turning my body away from the microphone and steering me back toward the pews. Through the blur of my unshed tears, I locked eyes with my father. Richard simply crossed his arms and looked away silently, endorsing my mother's ruthless intervention. He had always viewed my presence as a liability, an uncomfortable reminder of the daughter who did not fit into his perfect corporate narrative. Then my gaze shifted to Cameron. My brother was leaning back against the wooden pew, a faint, arrogant smirk playing on his lips. He gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of dismissal. To him, I was nothing but a minor inconvenience that had just been swiftly neutralized. He adjusted his expensive tie thoroughly, enjoying the spectacle of my public humiliation. I was forced back into my seat, the folded pages of my eulogy crumpling uselessly in my sweating hands. The priest, looking slightly confused by the sudden change in program, awkwardly cleared his throat and stepped back to the microphone to continue the service himself. I sat there in the heavy silence, absorbing the judgmental stares of the relatives and family friends around me. They were whispering behind their hands, exchanging knowing glances. They knew the narrative my parents had carefully crafted over the past 4 years. To them, I was the unstable daughter who had made terrible life choices. I was the woman whose marriage had spectacularly imploded, the one who had allegedly been scammed by her own husband, leading to a humiliating personal bankruptcy. My parents had spent years reinforcing that lie to protect their own image. They painted me as the fragile, incompetent black sheep, while elevating Cameron as the visionary genius of the family. Sitting in that cold, hard pew, I felt the suffocating weight of my isolation. I was a forensic accountant capable of untangling the most complex financial frauds for my clients, yet I sat here utterly powerless against the emotional fraud my family perpetuated every single day. The priest droned on about my grandmother's generosity, but I could barely hear his words over the rushing sound of blood in my ears. The injustice of it all burned in my throat. I had spent countless hours sitting by my grandmother's hospital bed during her final months, holding her fragile hand, while my mother and brother were out attending charity galas and networking events. I was the one who listened to her final wishes. Yet here I was, silenced and pushed into the shadows so my family could maintain their flawless facade. I looked down at my hands, staring at the crumpled eulogy. It contained stories of my grandmother's resilience, how she built her life from the ground up, how she valued integrity over wealth. Stories that my parents desperately wanted to bury because those values highlighted their own moral bankruptcy. I realized then that my mother did not stop me just to be cruel. She stopped me because she was terrified of what I might say. She was terrified that my voice, my presence, my very existence threatened the delicate illusion of the perfect family she had constructed for this elite audience. For the remainder of the funeral service, I sat entirely rigid, trapped in a bubble of profound alienation. The beautiful choir sang, the incense burned, and the wealthy elites nodded in solemn respect, but I was completely alone. I felt a familiar urge to simply shrink away, to accept my role as the scapegoat, to apologize for breathing the same air as them. It was a survival mechanism I had learned long ago. Keep your head down, do not cause a scene, accept the punishment. But as the pallbearers stepped forward to lift the heavy mahogany casket, something inside me hardened. The devastating grief of losing my grandmother collided violently with the toxic reality of my family. I had lost everything I cared about. My marriage had fallen apart, my savings had been wiped out 4 years ago, and now the only family member who loved me was gone. I had nothing left to lose. As the congregation began to rise for the final procession, I remained in my seat, letting the sea of dark coats and expensive perfumes wash past me. I watched my mother linking arms with my father and my brother, walking proudly behind them, accepting the sympathetic nods of the crowd. They looked so secure, so untouchable in their arrogance. They believed they had won. They believed they had successfully silenced me forever. I slowly stood up, smoothing out the wrinkles in my simple black dress. I did not know it yet, but this moment of absolute despair was the final calm before a storm that would tear their entire world apart. I took a slow, deep breath, preparing to walk out of the church and into the bleak, rainy afternoon. I assumed this was the end of the nightmare. I was completely unaware that the real nightmare, the one that would force me to uncover the darkest secrets of my own bloodline, was waiting for me just a few steps away, down a dark basement corridor. The reception hall adjacent to the sanctuary was already buzzing with the quiet hum of strategic networking. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with silver trays of champagne and miniature hors d'oeuvres. I stood near the arched entryway watching my parents work the room. Patricia had miraculously recovered from her aggressive display at the podium. She was currently nodding sympathetically at a local judge, her tragic widow veil pushed back just enough to show off her diamond earrings. Richard and Cameron were deep in conversation with a group of venture capitalists, laughing softly at a joke that had absolutely nothing to do with honoring my grandmother. They were treating her funeral like an exclusive corporate mixer. I turned away, feeling a surge of nausea. I just wanted to grab my coat and disappear into the rainy Boston afternoon. I took a step toward the cloakroom when a hand gently touched my shoulder. I flinched, expecting my mother to deliver another venomous threat. But when I turned around, I saw the tired, deeply lined face of Arthur Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell had been my grandmother's personal estate lawyer and trusted confidant for over 3 decades. He was a meticulous man who always wore outdated tweed suits and carried a battered leather briefcase. Today, his usual professional calm was replaced by a tense, urgent energy. "Madeline," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to come with me right now." I looked at him in confusion. "Mr. Mitchell, I really just want to go home. I cannot stay here and watch them use her memory like a networking opportunity." He stepped closer, physically blocking my line of sight to the reception hall. "You do not understand, Madeline. You need to see something immediately. It concerns your grandmother, and it concerns your future." Then his eyes darted nervously over my shoulder, toward where my father was standing. He leaned in closer, and his tone dropped to a grave warning. "Do not let your parents or your younger brother see you leave with me. Tell absolutely no one where you are going. Walk toward the restrooms and then slip through the service door at the end of the hall. I will be waiting on the other side." Before I could ask a single question, he turned and melted into the crowd of dark suits. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. Mr. Mitchell was not a man prone to theatrics or secrecy. If he was telling me to sneak away from my own family, something was terribly wrong. I glanced back at the reception hall. Patricia was still playing the grieving daughter, and Cameron was handing out business cards. Nobody was paying attention to the disgraced, bankrupt daughter. I kept my head down and walked purposefully toward the restrooms at the back of the building. When the hallway cleared, I quickly pushed open the heavy wooden service door and stepped into the dimly lit back corridor of the funeral home. Mr. Mitchell was waiting exactly as promised. He did not say a word. He simply gestured for me to follow him. We walked down a narrow concrete stairwell that led deep into the basement of the facility. The sounds of the reception above us completely vanished, replaced by the stark silence of the underground level. The air down here was cold and smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. Mr. Mitchell led me down a long, windowless hallway lined with closed doors. He stopped in front of a heavy oak door at the very dead end of the corridor. "This is a private soundproofed office the director lets me use for confidential estate readings," he explained softly, placing his hand on the brass doorknob. "Madeline, what you are about to see is going to be a profound shock. I need you to promise me that you will keep your voice down and listen to what we have to say." My hands started to shake. "What is going on, Mr. Mitchell? Did my grandmother leave a message?" He turned the knob and pushed the heavy oak door open. "Please step inside." I walked into the room. It was a small windowless space illuminated only by a single desk lamp casting long shadows against the wood-paneled walls. A man was standing in the corner with his back turned to the door, looking at a bookshelf. He wore a simple dark suit and his shoulders were tense. He turned around slowly. The air completely left my lungs. My vision blurred and my knees buckled so violently I had to grab the edge of a leather chair to stay upright. The room started to spin. I tried to speak, but my throat was entirely paralyzed. Standing in front of me, looking older and infinitely more exhausted than the last time I saw him, was David. My ex-husband. Madeline, he said, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. A violent cocktail of rage, shock, and pure adrenaline flooded my system. 4 years. For 4 agonizing years, I had lived with the humiliating, devastating belief that the man I loved had destroyed my life. According to my parents, David had embezzled every single penny of my startup funds, drained our joint accounts, and fled the state in the middle of the night like a coward. They told me he was a con artist, a gold digger who only married me to get close to the family wealth. When I woke up that morning 4 years ago to an empty house and zeroed-out bank accounts, I was completely broken. My parents had to bail me out of personal bankruptcy, and they never let me forget it. They used my ruined marriage as the ultimate proof that I was incompetent and naive. And now here he was standing in a funeral home basement looking at me with haunted eyes. You... I finally choked out, my voice trembling with a rage so deep it physically hurt. How dare you? How dare you show your face here after what you did to me? I took a step forward, my hands curled into fists. I will call the police. I will have you arrested right now for fraud and grand larceny. Madeline, please, David pleaded, holding his hands up defensively. Just give me 5 minutes. That is all I ask. 5 minutes to tell you the truth, and then you can call whoever you want. I turned wildly to the lawyer. Mr. Mitchell? Why is this criminal in the same room as me? Do my parents know he is here? No, Madeline, Mr. Mitchell said firmly, closing the oak door and locking it behind us. And they must never know. David is not a criminal. He did not steal your money. Your grandmother knew this, and that is why she instructed me to bring you here today. I stared at the old lawyer, feeling like the ground beneath my feet had just turned to liquid. What are you talking about? I saw the bank statements. The money was transferred to an offshore account from his laptop. He left a note saying he was sorry, but he needed a fresh start. David took a hesitant step toward me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. The note was dictated to me, Madeline. Your father stood over me in our living room while your mother packed my bags. Richard told me exactly what to write. He threatened that if I changed a single word, he would ensure you went to federal prison. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. That makes absolutely no sense. Why would my father send me to prison? For what? For tax evasion and corporate embezzlement, David answered softly. I shook my head violently. I never embezzled anything. I am a forensic accountant. I play by the rules. I know you do, David said. But your parents do not. 4 years ago, Cameron was trying to launch his first tech company. He promised investors the world, but he blew through their capital in 6 months on luxury cars and expensive parties. He was facing massive lawsuits and potential jail time for defrauding those investors. Your parents panicked. They could not let their golden child go to prison and ruin the family name, so they needed cash immediately to bail him out and cover his tracks. David swallowed hard, looking down at the floor before meeting my eyes again. They used your social security number and your professional credentials to set up dummy corporations. They forged your signature on loan documents. Then they transferred all the money from your startup fund and your personal savings directly into Cameron's failing company to save him. My mind reeled, struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal he was describing. That is impossible, I whispered, stepping back. Mr. Mitchell walked over to the desk and opened his battered leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of documents and laid them under the light of the desk lamp. It is the truth, Madeline, he said solemnly. Your grandmother suspected Richard was hiding something when he suddenly paid off Cameron's investors. She hired a private investigator and had me pull the financial records. Your parents framed David to cover their tracks. David stepped closer, his voice filled with a desperate, agonizing sincerity. Richard came to the house while you were away at an accounting seminar. He showed me the forged documents. He showed me the paper trail that made it look like you had orchestrated a massive fraud scheme to fund your own business. He told me the feds were already investigating. He said he had the power to protect you, to make the evidence disappear, but only if I took the fall for the missing money and vanished. A cold, paralyzing realization began to wash over me. You left to protect me, I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Richard told me that if I stayed and fought, he would hand the forged evidence directly to the authorities. David said, a tear finally slipping down his cheek. He promised that if I took the blame for emptying the accounts, he would clear your name and cover your debts. I had no money for a lawyer to fight a billionaire like your father. I had 24 hours to pack a bag and leave the state. I thought I was saving your life, Madeline. I thought I was keeping you out of a federal penitentiary. I stared at the documents on the desk. My professional brain, the forensic accountant who analyzed data for a living, took over. I stepped toward the light and looked at the papers. There were bank routing numbers, transfer logs, and incorporation documents. I recognized my mother's maiden name listed as the primary shareholder on a shell company. I saw the exact amount of my lost savings wired directly into a corporate account registered to Cameron. The puzzle pieces locked together with a sickening, terrifying clarity. For 4 years, I had carried the shame of a failed marriage. I had endured my parents' constant condescension, their endless lectures about my poor judgment in men, and my financial incompetence. I had sat at family dinners listening to them praise Cameron for his brilliant business acumen while I ate the scraps of their pity. They did not just steal my money, they stole my husband. They stole my confidence. They systematically dismantled my life and my sanity just to protect a lazy, arrogant brother who had squandered his own opportunities. They had orchestrated my destruction and then positioned themselves as my saviors. A dark, suffocating rage began to build in my chest. It was not the fiery, explosive anger of a teenager. It was the cold, calculating wrath of a woman who had just realized her entire reality was a malicious, fabricated lie engineered by the people who were supposed to love her most. I looked up from the documents and met David's eyes. He looked so broken, so deeply scarred by the years he had spent in hiding, carrying the weight of a crime he never committed. He had sacrificed his reputation and his marriage to protect me from a monster who happened to share my DNA. Mr. Mitchell placed a gentle hand on my arm. Your grandmother wanted you to have this truth, Madeline. She knew she was dying, and she wanted to make sure you had the weapons you needed to fight back. She knew how brilliant you are. I turned to the lawyer, my vision perfectly clear, my heart beating with a slow, steady rhythm. What else did she leave me, Mr. Mitchell? The lawyer reached into his briefcase one more time. The documents are just the beginning, Madeline. Now we need to discuss her real will and the trap your parents are walking right into as we speak. Before Mr. Mitchell could utter another word, the sharp buzz of a cell phone shattered the heavy silence in the basement room. He reached into his tweed jacket and pulled out his device. His gray eyebrows pulled together in a tight frown as he read the glowing screen. He looked up and met my gaze. "It is your father," he said, his tone clipped and serious. "He is demanding your presence in your grandmother's study right now. He claims it is an urgent family matter regarding the estate." David tensed, taking a protective step toward me, but I held up my hand. The initial shock of seeing David had completely evaporated, leaving behind a chilling, absolute clarity. I knew exactly what my father wanted. He wanted to finalize his victory. "Go," Mr. Mitchell advised quietly, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Play along with whatever they say. Do not react. Do not let them know you have spoken to us or that you know the truth about the missing money. Let them show their hand first. We will be right here waiting for you when you return." I nodded once. I turned away from the two men who held the keys to my vindication and walked out of the soundproofed office. I climbed the concrete stairs back to the main level of the funeral home, my mind racing with cold, calculating precision. Every step I took felt different. 10 minutes ago, I was a broken, isolated outcast. Now I was a forensic accountant armed with the knowledge of a massive federal crime committed by my own blood. I slipped back through the service door and navigated the crowded reception hall. The wealthy guests were beginning to disperse, filtering out into the rainy evening. I ignored the lingering stares and made my way toward the grand staircase that led to the private upper rooms of the estate. My grandmother's study had always been a sanctuary of intellect and quiet strength. It smelled of aged paper cedarwood and her signature lavender perfume. But as I pushed open the heavy double doors, that familiar warmth was entirely gone. The room had been hostilely taken over. My father Richard was sitting behind my grandmother's massive mahogany desk. He looked entirely too comfortable leaning back in her leather chair, with his hands steepled beneath his chin. My mother Patricia stood by the large bay window, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. She wore an expression of supreme satisfaction. And lounging carelessly across my grandmother's antique velvet sofa was Cameron. He was tapping away on his phone, looking profoundly bored by the very funeral we had just attended. "Close the door, Madeline," my father commanded, using his booming corporate boardroom voice. I pushed the heavy door shut, hearing the solid click of the latch locking us in. I did not take a seat. I stood in the center of the room, facing the desk, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression entirely blank. "We need to discuss the future of this family and the disposition of your grandmother's estate." My father began pulling a crisp white document from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. "As you know, your grandmother was getting on in years. Her mind was not as sharp as it once was. However, we were fortunate enough to help her finalize her affairs before she passed." He placed the document on the center of the desk, smoothing it out with his large hands. "We found her final will and testament in her personal safe yesterday morning." I stared at the paper. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that the document sitting on that desk was a complete forgery. Mr. Mitchell had the real ironclad trust secured away. My parents were executing the very fraud I had just been warned about. My father cleared his throat and looked down at the forged pages. "I will save you the tedious legal jargon, Madeleine. The estate has been left entirely to Cameron. All of the properties, the investment portfolios, the liquid assets, and the charitable foundations are now under his sole control." He looked up at me, expecting a reaction, expecting tears or a dramatic outburst. I gave him absolutely nothing. I just stared at him, my silence hanging heavy in the room. "It is the only logical choice," my mother chimed in, stepping away from the window. "Cameron is the future of this family. He is building a massive technology empire. He has the business acumen to manage wealth of this magnitude. You, on the other hand, have proven to be a severe financial liability." She took a slow sip of her water, looking me up and down with barely concealed disgust. "We cannot risk placing family assets in the hands of someone who let her own husband drain her bank accounts and run away. You are simply not responsible enough to handle an inheritance. We are actually protecting you from yourself by ensuring Cameron controls the capital." The sheer audacity of her words almost made me laugh. She was using the very crime she committed against me as the justification for cutting me out of my grandmother's fake will. She had orchestrated the theft of my startup funds, framed my husband, forced him into hiding, and was now using that fabricated trauma to label me incompetent. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Cameron finally looked up from his phone. He let out a short, arrogant scoff. "Do not look so miserable, Maddie," he sneered, dropping his phone onto the velvet sofa. "It is not like you know what to do with money anyway. You just crunch numbers for other people. I actually create value. I am building a legacy. The estate needs to be leveraged to grow my company." I kept my hands relaxed at my sides, refusing to give them the satisfaction of my anger. "And what exactly does this mean for me?" I asked, my voice steady and devoid of any emotion. My mother set her glass down on a side table. "It means you no longer have a place here, Madeline. The estate belongs to your brother now. The guest cottage you have been occupying on the edge of the property needs to be cleared. Cameron wants to demolish it to build a proper security facility for the main house." She stepped closer to me, her eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "You have 24 hours to pack your things and vacate the premises. Do not try to take any of your grandmother's belongings. Everything in that cottage is now the legal property of your brother. I am sure you are used to packing up your life quickly after your husband left you with nothing. You should have plenty of practice." The cruelty in her voice was absolute. 4 years ago, those words would have shattered me. 4 years ago, I would have collapsed onto the floor, sobbing and begging them for help. I would have internalized their abuse, believing I was a worthless failure who deserved to be cast out into the street. But I was not that broken girl anymore. The woman standing in this study knew the truth. I looked at my mother, seeing her not as an intimidating matriarch, but as a desperate, terrified criminal who was deeply in debt and grasping at forged papers to save her fraudulent son. "Are we clear?" Madeline, my father asked, leaning forward over the desk. "You will leave the property quietly. You will not contest this will. You will not cause a scene with the lawyers. If you do, I will personally ensure that your current accounting firm fires you for gross insubordination and mental instability. We have carried your dead weight long enough." Before I could formulate a response, Cameron stood up from the sofa. He stretched his arms casually and walked over to the desk. He picked up a thick folded piece of premium cardstock and walked toward me. He stopped just inches from my face, invading my personal space with a smug, predatory grin. "Since you are not getting any of the inheritance, you can at least do one useful thing for this family," he said, shoving the folded cardstock against my chest. I reflexively brought my hand up and caught the paper. "What is this?" I asked, looking down at the thick document. "It is the invoice for the funeral catering and the floral arrangements," Cameron said, casually adjusting his expensive tie. $45,000. Mom and Dad already paid for the casket and the burial plot. It is only fair that you cover the reception. You can use your pathetic accountant's salary to pay it off. Consider it your final act of respect to the family you disgraced." I looked down at the invoice in my hands. $45,000. They were evicting me from my home, cutting me out of my family, stealing my inheritance, and then handing me a massive bill for the funeral of the only person who ever loved me. They wanted to financially ruin me all over again. They wanted to break my spirit so completely that I would never have the strength to question their authority. Cameron let out a low, mocking laugh. "Do not worry, Maddie. If you cannot afford it, you can always set up a payment plan with the caterer. I am sure they take pity on bankrupt divorcees." My mother smiled, crossing her arms. "We expect you gone by tomorrow evening, Madeline. Do not make us call security to escort you off the property." I stood in the center of the grand study, surrounded by the people who shared my blood. I felt a cold, terrifying silence wash over my mind. I remembered the agonizing pain of my eviction 4 years ago. I remembered sitting in a cheap motel room crying until my vision blurred, wondering what I had done to deserve such a miserable life. I remembered the crushing weight of believing my husband had betrayed me. But I was not going to cry today. I was not going to beg. I was not going to argue with criminals who were actively handing me the rope to hang them with. I looked at Cameron, noting the smug arrogance in his eyes. I looked at my mother, seeing the vicious satisfaction on her face. I looked at my father, sitting behind the desk he was trying to steal. I memorized their expressions. I wanted to remember exactly how confident they looked in this moment, so I could savor the exact moment I tore it all away from them. I carefully folded the $45,000 invoice perfectly in half. I folded it again, making the creases sharp and precise. I calmly slipped the paper into the pocket of my black dress. I did not say a single word. I simply turned around and walked toward the heavy double doors. I reached out, turned the brass handle, and pulled the door open. My father called out my name, demanding I acknowledge his orders, but I ignored him entirely. I stepped out of the study, closing the doors softly behind me, leaving them to revel in their fabricated victory. I walked down the grand staircase, my posture perfectly straight, my heart beating with cold, relentless purpose. I was heading straight back down into the basement. It was time to unleash the truth. I descended the concrete steps into the basement, moving with a silent urgency. The heavy oak door was waiting at the end of the corridor, exactly as I had left it. I gave 2 quick knocks before turning the brass handle. David and Mr. Mitchell were standing by the desk, their expressions tight with anticipation. As I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, David rushed forward, searching my face for any sign of a breakdown. "What happened?" David asked, his voice laced with concern. "Are you all right, Madeline? What did Richard do?" I reached into the pocket of my black dress, pulled out the perfectly folded invoice, and dropped it onto the center of the desk. "They are evicting me," I said, my tone perfectly flat. They produced a forged will naming Cameron as the sole beneficiary of the entire estate. I have 24 hours to pack up my life and vacate the guest cottage. And to ensure I leave properly humiliated, they ordered me to pay the $45,000 catering bill for the funeral reception. David stared at the invoice, his jaw tightening. This is exactly what they did to me. They back you into a corner, strip you of your resources, and make you feel like you are the one at fault. They are monsters. Mr. Mitchell let out a heavy sigh, picking up the invoice and examining it under the desk lamp. The audacity of Richard never ceases to amaze me. He operates with the arrogant assumption that he is the smartest man in the room. But he severely underestimated your grandmother, and he severely underestimated me. The lawyer set the invoice aside and opened his battered leather briefcase. He carefully pulled out a thick bound folder sealed with heavy red wax and official notary stamps. He placed it reverently on the desk. Your grandmother was a brilliant woman. Mr. Mitchell began, his voice filled with profound respect. She built her wealth alongside your grandfather, and she knew how to protect it. When Richard began paying off Cameron's investors 4 years ago, she noticed the discrepancies in the family accounts. She knew Richard lacked the liquid capital to make those payoffs without severely jeopardizing the main company. When she discovered they had framed David and stolen your startup funds, she was utterly devastated. I felt a sharp ache in my chest. If she knew the truth, why did she not say anything? Why did she let me believe David abandoned me? Because Richard threatened to destroy you, David interjected softly. Your grandmother knew that if she confronted Richard without an airtight legal mechanism, he would have executed his threat to send you to prison using the forged evidence. She had to bide her time. She had to play the long game. Precisely, Mr. Mitchell agreed. She came to my office the very next day. We spent the last 4 years quietly restructuring her entire estate. We moved assets, liquidated vulnerable accounts, and established an impenetrable legal fortress. He tapped the thick folder on the desk. This is a living trust, Madeline. It bypasses probate entirely. It is ironclad, irrevocable, and utterly bulletproof against any challenge Richard might attempt to mount. In this document, your grandmother explicitly disinherits Richard, Patricia, and Cameron. She left her entire estate solely to you. I stared at the thick folder, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of his words. The entire estate. Every property, every investment portfolio, the charitable foundations. Everything Mr. Mitchell confirmed. The current valuation sits at exactly $40 million. You are a very wealthy woman, Madeline. The sheer scale of the inheritance hit me like a tidal wave. $40 million. My parents were upstairs drinking champagne and celebrating their theft of an empire that legally belonged to me. They were evicting a multimillionaire from a tiny guest cottage while they stood on her property. But that is not all, Mr. Mitchell continued, reaching into the briefcase one last time. He retrieved a small black leather-bound journal. The edges of the pages were worn, indicating it had been handled frequently. Your grandmother knew that giving you the money was only half the battle, Mr. Mitchell explained, handing the journal to me. She knew Richard would never simply walk away. He is too greedy and too desperate. To truly protect you, she knew you would need leverage. She spent the last 4 years compiling this. I opened the black journal. The pages were filled with my grandmother's meticulous, elegant handwriting. As a forensic accountant, it only took me a few seconds to realize exactly what I was looking at. It was a comprehensive ledger of Richard's illegal activities. She had tracked dates, routing numbers, offshore accounts, and shell corporations. She had documented the exact timeline of when Richard and Patricia moved my stolen startup funds into Cameron's failing company. She had even noted the names of the banking officials Richard had bribed to look the other way. This is a roadmap to a federal indictment, I whispered, tracing the ink with my fingertips. She mapped out their entire money laundering operation. She gathered the raw data, David said, stepping up to my side and looking at the pages. But she needed someone with the specific financial expertise to turn this data into a weapon. She knew you were the only one who could connect the dots and build an undeniable case. I closed the journal, feeling the heavy weight of the leather in my hands. My grandmother had spent her final years quietly building an arsenal for me. She had suffered in silence, playing the role of the oblivious matriarch, all while meticulously documenting the destruction of her own son to save her granddaughter. The love and sacrifice embedded in those pages gave me an immense, unshakable surge of power. I looked at Mr. Mitchell. So what is our next move? We take this trust document upstairs right now. We show them the real will and throw them out of my house. Mr. Mitchell shook his head, his expression grave. That is exactly what you must not do, Madeline. Why? David asked, his brow furrowing. It is an ironclad trust. Richard has no legal standing. Because Richard is a master of legal attrition, Mr. Mitchell explained, pacing the small room. If you march upstairs right now and reveal the true trust, Richard will immediately file an emergency injunction. He will hire a team of ruthless corporate lawyers to contest the document. He will claim your grandmother was subjected to undue influence. He will drag this into probate court and tie up your $40 million inheritance in litigation for the next 10 years. But we would eventually win, I countered. Yes, you would, Mr. Mitchell agreed. But Richard would drain millions of dollars from the estate in legal fees during the process. He would use your own money to fight you. And worse, it would remain a civil dispute. Forgery of a will is difficult to prove without a confession, and Richard would simply claim he found his document and believed it to be genuine. You might win the money, but Richard and Patricia would avoid prison. They would walk away free to continue their lives. I looked down at the forged invoice sitting on the desk. $45,000. I thought about the eviction notice. I thought about the 4 years of agonizing depression I endured believing I was a failure. I thought about David hiding in the shadows, robbed of his career and his marriage. Civil court was not enough. I did not just want my money back. I wanted absolute annihilation. If we do not show them the real trust, what do? I asked. We let them use the fake one, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, calculating tone. I looked at David and then at Mr. Mitchell, a strategic plan rapidly forming in my mind. If Richard and Patricia submit that forged will to a bank to secure a loan or transfer assets, it ceases to be a simple family dispute. It becomes wire fraud. It becomes bank fraud. If they use it to leverage Cameron's company, it becomes federal investor fraud. Mr. Mitchell smiled a slow, dangerous smile. Exactly. The moment they cross state lines or use a federally insured bank with that forged document, the FBI takes over. So we say nothing. I concluded, my heart beating with pure adrenaline. I will accept the eviction. I will let them throw me off the property. I will let them believe they have won. We retreat to the shadows and we watch them. We let them take that fake will and commit a federal crime that carries a mandatory prison sentence. We do not just take back the estate. We let them hand us the keys to their own prison cells. David looked at me, awe and fierce determination in his eyes. You are going to let them hang themselves. I pocketed my grandmother's ledger and picked up the catering invoice. I am going to build the gallows, I corrected him. We need to trace every single account listed in this journal. We are going to find out exactly what Cameron is planning to do with his fake tech company now that he thinks he has $40 million in collateral. I turned to Mr. Mitchell. Keep the real trust secure. Do not file anything until I give the signal. You have my word, Madeline, the lawyer said, packing the red-sealed folder back into his briefcase. I looked at David. Are you ready to get to work? David nodded, stepping toward the door. I have been waiting 4 years for this. We slipped out of the funeral home basement, leaving my family upstairs to drink their champagne and celebrate their hollow victory. They thought they had successfully evicted a broken woman. They had no idea they had just unleashed a financial predator who was coming to burn their entire empire to the ground. The rain was coming down in sheets by the time David and I reached my small one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was a stark, cramped contrast to the sprawling estate my parents were currently occupying. I unlocked the deadbolt and pushed the door open, flipping on the harsh overhead light. The space was sparse, functional, and entirely devoid of the luxury I had grown up with. I walked to my small dining table, clearing space for my laptop. David stood awkwardly by the door, rainwater dripping from his dark coat. For a fraction of a second, the reality of having him back in my personal space after 4 years of agonizing separation threatened to overwhelm me. I forced the emotion down, locking it in a mental vault. We did not have time for tears or apologies tonight. We had an empire to dismantle piece by piece. Take off your coat, I told him, pulling a secondary laptop from my work bag and booting it up. I am making coffee. It is going to be a very long night. By the time I returned from the kitchen with 2 steaming mugs, David had already laid my grandmother's black leather ledger flat on the table. The worn pages were filled with columns of dates, offshore routing numbers, and cryptic acronyms. To anyone else, it would look like the ramblings of an elderly woman. To me, it was a perfectly constructed map leading straight to the heart of my parents' corruption. I sat down across from him, cracking my knuckles. As a forensic accountant, I spent my days untangling the most sophisticated financial frauds on the East Coast. My parents thought I was just a glorified bookkeeper. They had no idea they had handed their financial executioner the exact tools she needed to ruin them. Give me the exact date my father came to the house and threatened you, I said, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. David did not hesitate. October 14th. It was a Tuesday. He arrived at 7 in the evening, holding a manila folder filled with forged wire transfers bearing your signature. I typed the date into my specialized auditing software, cross-referencing it with the first entry in my grandmother's ledger. I bypassed standard search protocols, utilizing a series of encrypted databases my firm used to track ghost accounts. My screen flooded with lines of raw financial data. The numbers cascaded in bright green rows, reflecting transaction histories from 4 years ago. The volume of hidden transactions demonstrated intense premeditation. This was not a sudden decision. This was a carefully orchestrated financial assassination. I isolated the bank records from my former joint accounts. The initial withdrawal was staggering, $450,000. Every single cent of my life savings and the initial seed money for my independent accounting practice vanished in a single keystroke. At the time, the bank claimed the transfer was authorized from a device registered to David. My parents had paid a private security contractor to spoof his IP address, creating a digital footprint that pointed entirely to my husband. But they made a fatal error. They assumed nobody would ever possess the offshore routing numbers needed to track where the money actually landed. My grandmother had those numbers. I typed the first 12-digit routing code from her ledger into my tracking software. The program churned for a tense 30 seconds before pinging with a match. The stolen funds had not been withdrawn as cash or moved to a tropical tax haven. They had been funneled into a domestic holding account registered in Delaware. Look at this, I said, pointing to the screen. David leaned in close, his shoulder brushing mine. The proximity sent a phantom ache through my chest, but I kept my eyes locked on the monitor. The holding account was opened just 3 days before your father threatened you, I explained. They set up the safety net before they even sprang the trap. They knew exactly what they were doing. Someone had to sign the incorporation documents. I launched a secondary query pulling public records from the Delaware Division of Corporations. I bypassed the redacted privacy screens by tracing the associated tax identification numbers. A PDF document slowly loaded onto my screen, displaying the original articles of incorporation for a company called Apex Holdings, LLC. I zoomed in on the signature line at the bottom of the second page. My blood ran cold. The signature belonged to Patricia Caldwell, my mother's maiden name. She did not use a proxy, I said, a bitter laugh escaping. She used her maiden name, assuming the offshore routing would completely mask the origin of the funds. They were so arrogant, so certain of their own superiority that they left a direct paper trail tying her to the stolen money. David stared at the screen, his fists clenching on the table. She signed the papers to steal your future while she was sitting in our living room offering you a shoulder to cry on. I felt a sharp, visceral stab of betrayal. I vividly remembered my mother holding me on the sofa, stroking my hair as I sobbed over David's sudden disappearance. She had told me that men were inherently selfish and that I was lucky the family was there to protect me. While she was comforting me, her signature was drying on the very document that authorized my financial ruin. I pushed the memory aside. Let us see where Patricia sent the money next, I said, my fingers flying across the keys. Apex Holdings was just a transit point. They needed to wash the money before it reached its final destination. I tracked a series of rapid-fire wire transfers. The $450,000 was broken down into smaller increments of $49,000 to avoid triggering federal reporting thresholds. The money bounced between three different dummy corporations over the span of 48 hours. It was a classic layering technique designed to confuse auditors and bury the original source of the capital. But I was not a standard auditor. I anticipated their evasive maneuvers. I built a predictive algorithm on my second laptop mapping the flow of the fragmented deposits. Slowly, a clear structural web emerged on the screen. The scattered funds were converging on a single corporate entity located right here in Boston. I pulled up the corporate registration for the final destination account. The name flashed across the screen. It was a technology firm called Nexus Innovations. I felt the air leave my lungs. Nexus Innovations was Cameron's first major tech startup, the one my parents endlessly praised, the one that was supposed to revolutionize the logistics industry. But as I pulled the historical financial records for Nexus Innovations, the truth painted a violently different picture. 4 years ago, Cameron's golden startup was weeks away from a catastrophic total bankruptcy. He had secured millions from private angel investors and squandered it on luxury corporate retreats, custom sports cars, and a lavish penthouse office. It had zero revenue. The investors were preparing to file a massive class action lawsuit for gross negligence and fraud. If those lawsuits went public, Cameron would have faced severe federal charges. The family name would have been permanently disgraced in the Boston elite circles my parents worshipped. I traced the dates of the fragmented deposits. The exact moment my stolen savings hit Cameron's corporate accounts, he immediately authorized massive payouts to his angry investors. He bought their silence. He settled the debts out of court and dissolved Nexus Innovations, entirely keeping his pristine reputation intact. To the outside world, he was a brilliant young entrepreneur who responsibly exited a challenging market. Behind closed doors, he was a terrified fraud who needed his parents to steal his sister's life savings just to survive. My $450,000 was the exact amount required to keep my brother out of a federal penitentiary. I sat back in my chair, the harsh light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. The silence in the small apartment was deafening. "They destroyed my life," I whispered, the horrifying reality settling deep into my bones. "They framed the man I loved. They forced me into a humiliating bankruptcy. They watched me endure years of agonizing depression. And they did it all just to protect Cameron's fragile ego. They sacrificed my entire existence to save their golden child from facing the consequences of his own arrogance." David walked around the table and placed his hands firmly on my shoulders. "We are going to make them pay, Madeline. We are going to take everything from them." I looked at the undeniable proof glowing on the screen. The pain of the betrayal was gone, replaced by a terrifying, absolute resolve. They thought I was a fragile, broken woman. They had no idea they had just armed a predator. I closed my grandmother's ledger, placing my hand flat against its worn leather cover. "Let them plan their fake empire," I said, my voice turning to pure ice. "We are going to burn it to the ground." The glowing screens of my dual monitors were the only source of light in the small apartment, casting sharp blue shadows across the dining table. It was past 3 in the morning. David had fallen asleep on the sofa an hour ago, his arm draped protectively across his chest, his face finally free of the tense, hyper-vigilant expression he had worn for 4 years. I, however, was wide awake, running purely on adrenaline and black coffee. The scope of my family's betrayal had ripped the exhaustion right out of my system. I was hunting. I needed to know exactly what Cameron was doing with Nexus Innovations now. The $450,000 they stole from me had saved him from immediate prison time 4 years ago, but that was just life support. It was not growth capital. And yet, my parents endlessly bragged about Cameron's massive tech empire. They flaunted his success at every country club dinner and charity gala. If the company was fundamentally broken 4 years ago, how was it suddenly a titan of industry today? I opened a secure VPN connection and accessed the Securities and Exchange Commission public filing database known as EDGAR. I typed in Nexus Innovations and hit enter. The database immediately returned a massive file. It was an S1 registration statement. My breath caught in my throat. An S1 filing meant only one thing. Cameron was preparing for an initial public offering. He was taking Nexus Innovations public. I downloaded the 300-page document and began tearing through the financial disclosures. According to the filing, Nexus Innovations was seeking to raise $150 million from Wall Street venture capitalists. The prospectus painted a picture of a revolutionary artificial intelligence logistics platform poised to dominate the global supply chain market. It was stuffed with buzzwords, aggressive growth projections, and polished corporate jargon. But as a forensic accountant, I did not care about the marketing copy. I cared about the raw numbers. I scrolled down to the audited financial statements section. I cross-referenced the revenue columns with the operating expenses. I ran the numbers through a quick diagnostic program I had built for detecting corporate fraud. The results were completely devastating. Nexus Innovations had absolutely zero actual revenue. They did not have a functional product. They did not have paying clients. They did not have a legitimate supply chain. The company was a meticulously constructed ghost ship. Cameron was inflating the valuation by logging massive investments as generated revenue, passing capital between subsidiary shell companies to create the illusion of financial velocity. He was running a highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme masquerading as a tech startup. But to launch an IPO of this magnitude, you needed massive upfront capital to pay the underwriters, the investment banks, and the legal teams. Wall Street did not take companies public for free. Cameron needed bridge loans, massive high-interest short-term loans from Tier 1 financial institutions to float the company until the IPO money hit the bank. And to get those loans, he needed collateral, real tangible collateral. I opened a secondary window and accessed the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds. I searched for recent property liens and loan originations under Richard and Patricia's names. I pulled the data from the last 48 hours, knowing exactly what I was looking for. There it was, a massive commercial bridge loan origination document filed just yesterday morning with a major international bank. The loan amount was a staggering $25 million. I clicked on the collateral schedule attached to the loan document. My eyes scanned the list of assets pledged to the bank in the event of default. The list included the Beacon Hill Mansion, the Martha's Vineyard summer home, the investment portfolios, and the commercial real estate holdings. Every single item on that collateral schedule matched the asset list from my grandmother's real trust document. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Richard and Patricia had taken the forged will, the fake document, that named Cameron as the sole beneficiary of my grandmother's $40 million estate and presented it to the bank. Because my grandmother had just passed away and the estate had not officially entered probate, the bank accepted the forged will as proof of imminent inherited wealth. The bank believed that Cameron, backed by Richard and Patricia, was a multi-millionaire who could easily cover the $25 million bridge loan. They had crossed the ultimate legal line. 4 years ago, they stole from their daughter. That was a localized, contained family crime. It was devastating, but it was difficult to prosecute without David's testimony and a clear paper trail. But this was entirely different. By presenting a forged document to a federally insured bank to secure a multi-million-dollar commercial loan, they had committed massive, undeniable federal bank fraud. And they had done it because they thought they had successfully neutralized me. They thought that by evicting me from the guest cottage and threatening to ruin my accounting career, they had silenced the only person who could challenge the fake will. They were completely unaware that Mr. Mitchell held the real ironclad trust document. They were completely unaware that the $40 million they just pledged to the bank actually belonged to the very daughter they had thrown out on the street. I sat back in my chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. The sheer arrogant stupidity of their plan was staggering. They had built a massive house of cards on a foundation of gasoline, and they had just handed me the match. If the IPO went through, Cameron would secure the $150 million, pay off the bridge loan, and become a legitimate tech billionaire. Richard and Patricia would cement their status as the ultimate Boston power family. They would have successfully stolen my money, ruined my marriage, and built an empire on my ashes without ever facing a single consequence. But the IPO had not launched yet. According to the S1 filing, the official launch, gala was scheduled for this coming Friday. 3 days from now. 3 days until the Wall Street investors signed the final agreements and wired the funds. I looked over at David sleeping on the couch. I thought about the 4 years he spent running hiding in cheap motels, working under the table jobs, constantly terrified that the FBI was coming for him. I thought about the sheer psychological torture my parents had inflicted on him, breaking his spirit so completely that he believed he was protecting me by destroying himself. I looked at my grandmother's leather ledger sitting on the table. She had spent her final years quietly, meticulously gathering the evidence needed to protect me. She knew her son was a monster. She knew he would stop at nothing to feed his own greed. She had suffered the agonizing pain of watching him tear my life apart, all so she could build this legal fortress to ensure he never hurt me again. I was not going to let her sacrifice be in vain. I was not going to let David's suffering be ignored. I turned back to the monitors, my mind calculating variables, timelines, and legal jurisdictions with cold mechanical precision. A civil lawsuit contesting the forged will would take years. It would give Richard time to hide assets, hire aggressive defense lawyers, and spin the narrative in the press. He would claim it was a simple misunderstanding, a tragic family dispute over a grieving mother's wishes. I did not want a civil lawsuit. I wanted a federal indictment. To get a federal indictment, I needed to let them execute the fraud completely. I needed to let them walk onto that stage on Friday night. I needed to let them sign the final IPO documents in front of the Wall Street investors. I needed the federal crime to be absolutely fully committed in front of hundreds of witnesses so that no high-priced defense attorney could ever claim it was a simple mistake. I began compiling a digital dossier. I downloaded the S1, filing the forged bridge loan documents and the corporate registration showing Patricia's signature on the shell company. I scanned the pages of my grandmother's ledger linking the offshore routing numbers to Cameron's original startup funds. I built a comprehensive bulletproof financial map that proved a continuous, uninterrupted pattern of wire fraud, extortion, and bank fraud spanning 4 years. This was not just a folder of evidence. It was a strategic, targeted weapon designed for maximum destruction. I checked the time. It was 4 in the morning. I had exactly 72 hours to coordinate the strike. I needed to leverage my professional contacts. As a forensic accountant, I frequently worked alongside federal investigators on complex corporate audits. I knew exactly which agents in the white-collar crime division of the FBI had the jurisdiction and the appetite for a case of this magnitude. I saved the encrypted dossier to an external hard drive and ejected it from the laptop. I held the small metal drive in the palm of my hand, feeling the heavy, incredible power it contained. I stood up from the table, my muscles stiff and aching from hours of intense focus. I walked over to the sofa and gently placed my hand on David's shoulder. He woke with a sudden start, his eyes darting around the room in a moment of panicked disorientation before focusing on me. "What is it?" he asked, sitting up quickly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Did they find us?" "No," I said, my voice low and steady. "They did not find us. But we found them. I have everything, David. I have the entire network." He looked at me, his expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, fierce hope. "What are they doing?" "They are using the fake will to secure a $25 million bank loan," I explained, handing him the hard drive. "They are using my grandmother's estate as collateral to launch an IPO for Cameron's fake company. They are committing federal bank fraud." David stared at the hard drive in his hands, his knuckles turning white. "We take this to the police right now. We end this today." I shook my head, my eyes locking onto his. "No. If we go to the police today, Richard will find a way to manipulate the system. He will claim he did not know the will was fake. He will use his wealth to buy his way out of a simple investigation." I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "We are not going to the local police, David. We are taking this to the feds. And we are not going to stop the IPO. We are going to let Cameron stand on that stage on Friday night. We are going to let him look those Wall Street investors in the eye and sign his name to the fraud. We are going to let them build the gallows as high as possible. David looked at me, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. And then we kick the trapdoor open. Exactly, I said, standing up straight. Get some coffee, David. We need to go see Mr. Mitchell. We have a gala to crash. The rain finally stopped by the time the sun began to rise over the Boston skyline, casting a pale gray light through the windows of my apartment. We did not wait for regular business hours. By 7 in the morning, David and I were sitting in the quiet, heavy stillness of Mr. Mitchell's private office. The elderly lawyer listened intently as I laid out the strategy. I explained the bridge loan, the forged collateral, and the impending initial public offering. Mr. Mitchell did not flinch. He simply nodded, poured us both a cup of black coffee, and handed over the keys to his personal secure conference room. He gave us access to his private servers, ensuring our digital footprint would remain completely untraceable by my father's corporate security team. We spent the entire day compiling the data, structuring the evidence into a format that a federal prosecutor could digest in a single glance. But the sheer volume of paperwork required us to move the operation back to my apartment for the night shift. By midnight, my small dining table was completely buried under mountains of printed bank statements, tax returns, and corporate filings. The air in the room was thick with a heavy, suffocating tension. We had been working side by side for 18 hours straight. The physical proximity was taking a toll on both of us. Every time David leaned over to hand me a document, our shoulders would brush, sending a sharp electric jolt through my exhausted nervous system. For 4 years, I had trained myself to hate this man. I had spent countless nights crying into my pillow, cursing his name, wishing I had never met him. Rewiring my brain to accept him as an ally was a violent, jarring process. The silence between us grew louder and more oppressive with every passing hour. I pulled up a series of older tax documents from the year my startup funds were stolen. I needed to understand exactly how my father had executed the transfer without triggering an immediate audit from the Internal Revenue Service. As I scrolled through the digital files, I found a hidden subfolder buried deep within the archived metadata. I clicked it open and my blood turned to ice. The folder contained a completely fabricated set of tax returns registered under my Social Security number. The documents were meticulously forged. They showed a massive influx of undeclared income, hidden overseas accounts, and deliberate tax evasion. The numbers were structured to look exactly like a highly sophisticated money laundering operation. My father had hired someone incredibly skilled to construct a financial profile that painted me as a mastermind criminal. If these documents had ever been submitted to the authorities, they would have triggered an immediate federal investigation, resulting in catastrophic legal consequences. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. David, what is this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. David froze. He looked up from the stack of papers he was organizing, and his eyes locked onto the monitor. All the color drained from his face. He slowly lowered the documents to the table, taking a shaky step backward. His breathing became shallow and rapid. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice cracking with a sudden raw panic. "It was buried in the metadata of the transfer logs," I explained, turning the monitor so he could see the full scope of the forgery. "David, these are fake tax returns. They are designed to frame me for federal tax evasion. The penalties for this level of fraud carry a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary." "Did my father create these?" David did not answer immediately. He stared at the screen, his chest heaving, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The stoic, protective facade he had maintained since I found him in the basement funeral home suddenly shattered. He collapsed into the chair across from me, burying his face in his hands. A harsh, broken sob tore through his throat, echoing loudly in the quiet apartment. "David." I pushed my chair back and stood up, my heart pounding. "Tell me what happened. Tell me exactly what Richard did to you." He looked up at me, his eyes red and brimming with tears. The absolute agony etched into his features stopped me in my tracks. That is the folder your father brought to our house, he said, his voice thick with unresolved trauma. That is the exact file he threw onto our kitchen table 4 years ago while you were away at your accounting seminar. I walked around the table and knelt in front of him, resting my hands gently on his knees. Tell me everything, I said softly. He took a ragged breath, struggling to push the words past the massive lump in his throat. Richard walked into our home with two men in dark suits. They looked like private security. He threw that folder on the table and told me to look inside. I saw the tax returns. I saw your signature forged perfectly at the bottom of every page. I told him it was a lie. I told him you would never do something like that. David wiped a tear from his cheek, his hands shaking violently. Your father just laughed, Madeline. He told me it did not matter if it was a lie. He said he had already paid off a contact inside the agency. He said the moment he gave the signal, those documents would be officially filed and fast-tracked for a criminal investigation. He told me the federal agents would raid your office within 48 hours. They would parade you out of your building in handcuffs. They would destroy your professional license, your reputation, and your entire life. I felt a cold, nauseating horror wash over me. My own father had engineered a weapon designed to obliterate my existence just to protect his golden child. I tried to fight him. David continued, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. I told him I would go to the police. I told him I would hire the best lawyers in Boston to defend you. But Richard just looked at me with this dead, empty expression. He said I did not have the money to fight him. He said he could drag the trial out for years until we were completely bankrupt, and you would still end up in a federal prison cell. Then what happened? I asked, gripping his knees tighter. Then he gave me an ultimatum, David said, looking directly into my eyes. The absolute sincerity and pain in his gaze stripped away any lingering doubts I had. He said Cameron needed $450,000 immediately to stay out of jail. He said he was going to take it from your accounts. He told me that if I signed a confession taking the blame for the stolen money and vanished from the state immediately, he would destroy the fake tax returns. He promised me he would leave you alone. He promised me you would be safe. The room spun. The sheer magnitude of David's sacrifice crashed down on me with a physical force. He gave me 24 hours to pack my bags. David sobbed, the tears falling freely now. He had his security team escort me to the airport. I had to leave you a note making you believe I was a monster. I had to break your heart to save your life, Madeline. I had to let you hate me, because if you tried to find me, if you tried to defend me, your father would have pulled the trigger and sent you to prison. I have spent every single day of the last 4 years living in cheap motels, working minimum wage jobs, waking up in cold sweats, wondering if you were safe. Wondering if you were okay. I could not breathe. The tears I had been holding back for 4 years finally broke free, trailing hot and fast down my cheeks. I had spent thousands of hours cursing this man. I had blamed him for my bankruptcy, for my depression, for my overwhelming sense of failure. But he had never betrayed me. He had thrown himself onto a grenade to protect me. He had given up his career, his home, his reputation, and his marriage just to keep me safe from the true monsters. I stood up and pulled him out of the chair. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him into a fierce, desperate embrace. He buried his face in my shoulder, wrapping his arms around my waist, holding me as if he was terrified I might disappear. We stood there in the center of the apartment, surrounded by the financial wreckage of our past, holding on to each other and letting years of manufactured resentment completely evaporate. The emotional wall between us shattered. The anger and the bitterness were washed away, leaving behind a profound, unbreakable bond. We were no longer two isolated victims crushed under the weight of a billionaire family's greed. We were survivors. We had both been manipulated, tortured, and discarded by the same people. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had left us alive. I am so sorry, I whispered into his hair, holding him tighter. I am so sorry I ever doubted you, David. I should have known. I should have fought for you. You could not have known, he whispered back, his voice muffled against my shoulder. They designed it perfectly. They designed it to break us apart. I pulled back slightly, resting my hands on either side of his face. I looked into his eyes, seeing the exhausted but resilient man who had sacrificed everything for me. Well, they failed, I said, my voice hardening into steel. They tried to bury us, but they forgot that we know how to dig. David took a deep breath, wiping his face and nodding slowly. A new light entered his eyes. The fear and the trauma were receding, replaced by a cold, unified focus. We are going to destroy them, Madeline. We are going to tear down every single thing they care about. I turned back to the table, looking at the glowing monitors and the stacks of evidence. The emotional healing we just experienced was the final piece of the puzzle. My mind was completely clear. My resolve was absolute. There was no hesitation left in my heart. I did not care that Richard and Patricia shared my blood. I did not care about the family name. I only cared about justice. Sit down, I told David, sliding back into my chair and pulling the keyboard toward me. We have work to do. My mother wants to play games with fake businesses and stolen money. We are going to show her exactly what a real forensic accountant can do. David pulled his chair up right beside mine. We worked through the rest of the night, acting as a single cohesive unit. The tension that had plagued us earlier was entirely gone. We cross-referenced every shell company, tracking Patricia's signature across multiple state lines. We compiled the fraudulent tax returns Richard had created, adding them to the growing dossier of federal crimes. Every new document we found was another nail in their coffin. As the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a bright golden light across the dining table, we finalized the digital file. We had built an inescapable legal trap. We were no longer hiding. We were no longer running. The emotional closure had given me the ironclad resolve needed for the coming war. My parents thought they were untouchable. They thought they had outsmarted everyone. But they had no idea that the daughter they threw away and the husband they exiled had just become their absolute worst nightmare. We were ready. By 8 o'clock Tuesday morning, the storm had passed, leaving Boston bathed in harsh, brilliant sunlight. I left David at my apartment, setting up a secure remote workstation to monitor Cameron's corporate filings. I needed to maintain my daily routine. I needed my parents to believe I was completely broken and paralyzed by their eviction notice. If I broke character now, they would sense the trap. I arrived at the towering glass high-rise that housed my firm, Kensington and Gallagher. It was one of the most prestigious forensic accounting agencies on the East Coast. I had clawed my way up from a junior analyst to a senior director in just 4 years, using my work as a shield against the suffocating depression of my past. My reputation in this building was spotless. I was known as the Ice Queen of Audits, the woman who could find a hidden penny in a $1,000,000 spreadsheet. I stepped off the elevator and walked toward my corner office, grabbing a black coffee from the break room. The atmosphere on the trading floor felt slightly off. A few junior analysts averted their eyes as I passed. My executive assistant, usually bright and chatty, handed me my morning schedule with a tight, nervous smile. Before I could even take a sip of my coffee, my desk phone rang. It was the managing partner's executive secretary. She informed me that Mr. Gallagher and Miss Linwood required my presence in the main boardroom immediately. She added that I needed to bring my secure access keycard and leave my personal phone at my desk. A cold knot formed in my stomach. In the forensic accounting world, a sudden summons to the main boardroom without your phone meant only one thing: an internal security breach. I walked down the long glass corridor, my mind racing. I pushed open the heavy frosted doors of the boardroom. Mr. Gallagher, a stern man in his late 60s with zero tolerance for corporate liability, sat at the head of the massive mahogany table. Beside him sat Ms. Linwood, the head of internal compliance and risk management. Neither of them offered a greeting. "Have a seat, Madeline," Mr. Gallagher said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual warmth. I sat down, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "Is there a problem with the quarterly audits?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly level. Miss Linwood slid a thick manila folder across the polished wood table. "We received a series of highly concerning anonymous phone calls this morning, starting at 6 a.m. The caller claimed to be a close associate of your family. They provided highly specific details regarding your personal life and your current financial stability." My blood ran cold. The silence I had maintained regarding the eviction notice had deeply rattled my mother. Patricia thrived on dramatic reactions. My complete lack of response to being thrown out of the guest cottage had triggered her intense paranoia. She assumed my silence meant I was plotting something, so she decided to strike first. She was attempting a preemptive corporate assassination. What exactly did this anonymous caller allege? I asked, refusing to break eye contact with my superiors. Mr. Gallagher leaned forward, folding his hands. The caller stated that you are currently suffering from a severe psychotic break due to massive personal debts. They alleged that you are facing imminent eviction and bankruptcy. But most concerningly, Madeline, they claimed that you have been actively embezzling funds from our Tier 1 client trust accounts to cover your impending financial ruin. The sheer audacity of my mother's lie took my breath away. She was not just trying to get me fired. She was trying to strip me of my accounting license and send me to federal prison. In our industry, even the rumor of embezzlement was enough to destroy a career permanently. Patricia knew this. She had deliberately called the compliance department, knowing they would be forced to trigger an immediate internal investigation. She wanted to crush my livelihood so completely that I would be forced to crawl back to Richard and beg for his handout. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice. I leaned back in my leather chair, tapping into the absolute emotional detachment that made me the best auditor in the firm. I assume you have already frozen my system access and initiated a preliminary sweep of my client portfolios, I said calmly. Ms. Linwood nodded, looking slightly surprised by my complete lack of hysterics. Standard protocol was initiated at 7 a.m. Good, I replied. Then you already know the allegations are entirely baseless. However, to expedite this process and clear my name before lunch, I want you to initiate a deep-level zero open book audit of every single file, account, and transfer log I have touched in the last 48 months. Do not just check the Tier 1 clients, check everything. Mr. Gallagher raised an eyebrow. Madeline, an audit of that magnitude is highly invasive. We are giving you the opportunity to explain these allegations first. There is nothing to explain, I stated firmly. The caller was my mother, Patricia. My family is currently engaged in a highly volatile, high-value estate dispute following the death of my grandmother. My parents recently produced a deeply questionable will naming my younger brother as the sole heir to a $40 million estate. When I did not react to their attempt to illegally evict me from my grandmother's property, they panicked. This phone call is a retaliatory intimidation tactic designed to sever my primary source of income and force me into legal submission. The two managing partners exchanged a long, loaded look. In the world of high net worth forensic accounting, malicious family disputes over massive inheritances were incredibly common. They had seen spouses, siblings, and children orchestrate brilliant smear campaigns to ruin their rivals. I stood up from my chair, projecting absolute authority. I am a forensic accountant, Mr. Gallagher. If I wanted to steal money from this firm, you would not find out about it from an anonymous phone call. You would never find it at all. The very fact that someone called to warn you is proof of their desperation. Run the deep audit, pull the keystroke logs, verify every penny. I will sit in the glass conference room down the hall until you are completely satisfied. I walked out of the boardroom and headed straight to the transparent holding room. For 3 agonizing hours, I sat in a hard plastic chair while the compliance team tore my professional life apart. I watched through the glass walls as junior analysts ran my access codes through the mainframes. I knew my work was flawless. I knew there was not a single decimal point out of place. But the psychological warfare my mother was waging was beginning to take its toll. She was perfectly willing to destroy my freedom to protect her fake empire. Just before noon, the door to the holding room opened. Ms. Linwood stepped inside holding a printed report. Her stern expression had softened into one of genuine professional respect. We ran the deep sweep, she said, handing me my security access card. Your portfolios are immaculate, Madeline. In fact, your reconciliation rates are the highest in the division. There is absolutely no evidence of financial misconduct. We traced the anonymous calls to a burner phone purchased near Beacon Hill, but the voice pattern analysis strongly supports your theory of familial harassment. I took my key card, taking a slow, steadying breath. Thank you, Ms. Linwood. I apologize for the disruption this caused the firm. Mr. Gallagher stepped into the room behind her. You have nothing to apologize for, Madeline. We protect our own. If your family attempts to contact this firm again, our legal department will file a corporate harassment injunction against them immediately. We can also provide you with temporary private security if you feel physically threatened. I declined the offer for security, thanking them for their unwavering support. I walked back to my corner office, my mind spinning with a cold, dark fury. My mother had just tried to bury me alive. She had tried to take the one thing I had built entirely on my own, the one thing that gave me pride and stability, and smash it into pieces. I packed my briefcase, moving with sharp, precise motions. I told my assistant I was taking the rest of the day for personal legal matters and walked out of the building. The ride back to my apartment was a blur of righteous anger. The lingering shreds of daughterly obligation, the tiny, insignificant voice in the back of my mind that wondered if my parents could ever be redeemed, was completely silenced. Patricia had drawn a line in the sand. She had declared total, absolute war. I unlocked my apartment door and walked inside, throwing my briefcase onto the sofa. David was sitting at the dining table, tracking the venture capital movements on his laptop. He looked up, seeing the raw, unadulterated fury radiating from my posture. What happened? He asked, standing up quickly. My mother just tried to have me arrested for corporate embezzlement, I said, my voice dangerously calm. She called the managing partners at my firm and tried to trigger a federal investigation into my client accounts. She wants me destitute, discredited, and begging for mercy. David's eyes darkened, his jaw clenching tightly. She used the exact same playbook she used on me. She tries to isolate you and threaten your freedom, so you surrender without a fight. I walked over to the table and slammed my hands down onto the wooden surface. Well, she picked the wrong target this time. She thinks I am just a scared little girl who will run away when things get tough. She thinks she holds all the power because she has a forged piece of paper and a stolen mansion. I looked at David, the adrenaline surging through my veins like ice water. The gloves are officially off, David. No more hiding. No more waiting patiently for them to make a mistake. We are going to actively push them over the edge. I pulled my secure cell phone from my pocket and dialed Mr. Mitchell's private number. The lawyer answered on the second ring. Madeline, he said, is everything secure on your end? Mr. Mitchell? I said, staring at the glowing monitors tracking Cameron's fake company. I need you to draft the final asset freeze injunctions. Have them completely ready to file with the federal courts. Patricia just tried to destroy my career. She is desperate, she is terrified, and desperate people are incredibly predictable. What is the next phase? Mr. Mitchell asked, his tone matching my cold resolve. Richard is going to try to buy my silence, I explained. He knows Patricia failed to get me fired today. His next logical move is extortion. He will try to force me to sign a legal waiver giving up my rights to the estate in exchange for a tiny fraction of the money. Let him try, David said, stepping up beside me, his voice filled with quiet strength. We will use his own extortion attempt as the final nail in his coffin. I hung up the phone, feeling a profound sense of dangerous clarity. My mother had tried to break me today. She had tried to prove that I was nothing without their money and their name, but all she had done was prove that they were completely terrified of me. They knew I was a threat, and in 3 days I was going to show them exactly how dangerous I could be. The upscale coffee shop on Newbury Street was exactly the kind of place my father frequented. It was loud enough to mask a private conversation, but exclusive enough to keep the general public at a comfortable distance. The rich aroma of roasted espresso beans mingled with the scent of expensive leather and rain-damp wool coats. I sat in a booth near the back facing the entrance, sipping a green tea I had zero intention of finishing. My posture was deliberately slumped. I wore a plain beige sweater instead of my usual tailored blazers, and I had purposefully foregone makeup. I needed to look exactly like the broken, exhausted woman he expected to see. Hidden deep inside my oversized leather tote bag sitting innocently on the table was a high-definition digital audio recorder. David had purchased it earlier that morning. It was currently capturing every ambient sound in the cafe with crystal-clear precision, waiting for my father to deliver his lines. I checked my watch. 2:15 in the afternoon. He was 15 minutes late. A classic Richard power play designed to make me feel small and desperate. When he finally pushed through the glass doors, he looked like a man who owned the entire city block. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, an imported silk tie, and an expression of supreme, unbothered arrogance. He spotted me immediately, his eyes doing a quick dismissive sweep of my diminished appearance before he strode toward the booth. He slid into the leather seat across from me, not bothering to take off his coat or order a drink. He folded his large hands on the table and looked at me with a mixture of pity and severe irritation. "You look terrible, Madeline," he said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that barely carried over the noise of the espresso machines. I kept my eyes focused on my teacup, letting a tremor enter my voice. "It has been a difficult week. Your mother tells me you caused quite a stir at your firm yesterday," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "Apparently your managing partners are deeply concerned about your mental stability. It is truly unfortunate how quickly a professional reputation can unravel when personal finances spiral out of control." The blatant hypocrisy was stunning. He was framing my mother's malicious sabotage as a tragedy he had nothing to do with. I dug my fingernails into my palms under the table, using the physical pain to keep my rage from showing on my face. "I did not embezzle any money," I said, playing the defensive cornered victim. "You know I did not. The compliance audit cleared me completely." My father smiled, a cold, tight smile that never reached his eyes. "Compliance audits can always be reopened, Madeline. Board members talk. Managing partners attend the same country clubs I do. If someone were to suggest that your firm was harboring a volatile, bankrupt employee who was actively attempting to extort her grieving family, well, I imagine Mr. Gallagher would find it much easier to simply sever ties rather than risk the firm's pristine reputation." He was laying the groundwork perfectly. The recorder in my bag was picking up every single syllable. "What do you want?" I asked, letting my voice crack just enough to sound desperate. "Why did you ask me to meet you here?" "I am here to offer you a lifeline," he said, reaching into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. "Despite your continuous disrespect toward this family, your mother and I have decided to be generous. We understand that your living situation is currently precarious following your eviction from the guest cottage." He pulled out a crisp white envelope and laid it on the table between us. He slid it across the smooth wood, stopping just inches from my hands. "Open it," he commanded. I reached out with trembling fingers and opened the unsealed envelope. Inside was a cashier's check made out to me in the amount of $10,000. Tucked behind the check was a densely typed legal document spanning 3 pages. $10,000, I whispered, staring at the check. This was the price he put on my future. He was attempting to buy my silence, my dignity, and my $40 million inheritance for less than the cost of his luxury watch collection. "It is more than enough for a security deposit on a modest apartment and a few months of living expenses," my father said smoothly. "Consider it a severance package from the family. You take the money, you secure housing, and you quietly rebuild your life somewhere else." I looked up at him, letting tears well in my eyes. "And the document." "A simple formality," he replied, waving his hand dismissively. "It is a comprehensive legal waiver. It clearly states that you accept this $10,000 payment as the final absolute settlement regarding your grandmother's estate. By signing it, you legally relinquish any and all future rights to contest the will we presented in the study. You forfeit any claim to the properties, the trusts, the investments, and the corporate assets. You also agree to a strict non-disclosure clause prohibiting you from ever discussing the family finances publicly." He was trying to plug the only hole in his fraudulent scheme. Richard knew that the forged will naming Cameron as the sole heir was legally vulnerable if a direct blood relative challenged it in probate court. He needed a signed, notarized waiver from me to present to the bank, guaranteeing that no legitimate heir would suddenly appear and contest the collateral they were using for the bridge loan. $10,000, I repeated, shaking my head slowly. "The estate is worth $40 million. You are asking me to walk away from my entire heritage for $10,000. I am asking you to be realistic, Madeline." His tone hardened, the faux generosity vanishing instantly. "You are a divorced accountant with zero leverage and a highly unstable professional reputation. Cameron is launching a multi-million-dollar technology initial public offering this Friday. He needs the estate assets unencumbered by petty family litigation to secure his bridge loans. Your grandmother understood this. That is why she left the estate to him. He leaned in closer, his broad shoulders blocking the ambient light, his voice dropping to a harsh, menacing whisper. Let me make this incredibly simple for you. You take this check and you sign that waiver right now. If you refuse, I will personally ensure you never work in the financial sector again. I will make one phone call to the board of directors at your firm, and you will be terminated by 5 o'clock today. I will use the full weight of my corporate legal team to bury you in defamation lawsuits until you cannot even afford a public defender. I will utterly destroy whatever miserable little life you have managed to scrape together since your husband robbed you blind. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from the sheer exhilarating rush of victory. The audio recorder in my bag had just captured the holy grail of criminal evidence. He had explicitly tied the extortion attempt to Cameron's YPO. He had explicitly threatened my career and my freedom. He had explicitly admitted to leveraging his corporate power to force a signature on a legal document concerning an estate he did not own. I looked down at the waiver. The signature line stared back at me. A normal person would have thrown the coffee in his face and walked out. A normal person would have screamed at him for bringing up the husband he framed. But I was not a normal person. I was a forensic accountant orchestrating a federal takedown. I need a pen, I whispered, my voice breaking perfectly. My father smiled, a look of absolute arrogant triumph washing over his features. He reached inside his jacket and produced a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen, laying it gently on top of the legal waiver. Smart girl, he said softly. I always knew you had a pragmatic side. I picked up the heavy gold pen. My hand shook violently as I positioned the tip over the signature line. I let out a jagged, convincing sob as I signed my name, tracing the letters with slow, agonizing deliberation. I dated the document and pushed the paper back across the table, keeping the $10,000 check clutched in my hand. My father picked up the waiver, inspecting the signature with deep satisfaction. He folded the document neatly and tucked it securely into his breast pocket. He retrieved his gold pen and stood up from the booth, looking down at me like I was a piece of trash he had just scraped off his shoe. You have 72 hours to clear your remaining belongings out of the guest cottage, he said, adjusting his silk tie. Do not contact your mother. Do not contact Cameron. If we ever see you near the family properties again, I will have you arrested for trespassing. Goodbye, Madeline. He turned and walked out of the coffee shop, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the tile floor. He moved with the confident swagger of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. He pushed through the glass doors and disappeared into the rainy Boston afternoon, completely unaware that he had just handed me his own death warrant. I sat alone in the booth for 5 full minutes, waiting for my adrenaline to stabilize. I looked down at the $10,000 check sitting on the table. I picked it up, examining the crisp edges and the authorized signature. I slowly, deliberately smiled. I reached into my oversized tote bag and pressed the stop button on the digital audio recorder. The red recording light blinked off. I carefully removed the small memory card, sealing it inside a protective plastic case. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed Mr. Mitchell's private number. He answered almost immediately. Did he take the bait? The lawyer asked, his voice tense with anticipation. He swallowed it whole, I said, picking up my coat and sliding out of the booth. I have him threatening to destroy my career, explicitly attempting to extort my signature, and tying the entire operation directly to Cameron's impending IPO bridge loans. The audio is crystal clear. And the waiver, Mr. Mitchell asked. Signed, dated, and currently sitting in his breast pocket, I replied, walking toward the exit. He thinks he just neutralized the only threat to their fraud. He thinks he won. Mr. Mitchell let out a low, satisfied chuckle. Excellent work, Madeline. Bring the recording to my office immediately. It is time to prepare the final package. I hung up the phone and stepped out onto Newbury Street. The rain had stopped, leaving the air feeling crisp and electric. I walked toward the subway station, holding the memory card tightly in my pocket. My father thought he had bought my silence for $10,000. He had no idea he had just purchased a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. The heavy glass doors of Mr. Mitchell's law firm closed behind me, shutting out the noise of downtown Boston. I walked past the mahogany reception desk and headed straight for the private conference room at the back of the suite. David and Mr. Mitchell were already waiting for me at the large oval table. A laptop was set up next to a digital audio receiver, and stacks of legal reference books were arranged in neat piles. I walked into the room and placed the $10,000 cashier's check flat on the polished wood surface. Then I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the protective plastic case, and set the memory card right next to it. "I have everything," I said, taking off my damp coat. He said exactly what we needed him to say. David stood up immediately, his eyes scanning my face for any signs of lingering distress. He pulled out a chair for me and handed me a glass of water. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I know sitting across from him could not have been easy. "I am perfectly fine," I assured him, taking my seat. "In fact, I have never felt better." Richard was so blinded by his own arrogance that he practically read from a script. He thinks he just bought my silence and my $40 million inheritance for the price of a used car. Mr. Mitchell picked up the memory card with a look of grim satisfaction. "Let us hear it," he said, sliding the card into the digital receiver. He pressed play, and the ambient noise of the coffee shop filled the quiet conference room. The clinking of ceramic cups and the hiss of an espresso machine echoed through the speakers, followed by my father's booming, authoritative baritone. The recording was flawless, capturing every threatening nuance of his voice. We sat in complete silence as the audio played out. David clenched his jaw so tightly I could see a muscle feathering in his cheek as he listened to Richard methodically attempt to dismantle my life. We heard my father explicitly tie the legal waiver to Cameron's upcoming initial public offering. We heard him outline his calculated plan to weaponize his corporate connections to have me fired from my firm. We heard him threaten to bury me in frivolous defamation lawsuits until I was utterly destitute. When the audio reached the point where I shakily asked for a pen and signed the document, a chilling silence fell over the conference room. Mr. Mitchell reached out and pressed the stop button. "That is a masterpiece of criminal extortion," the elderly lawyer said, leaning back in his leather chair. "It is textbook coercion. He explicitly threatened your professional livelihood and your financial freedom to force a signature on a legal document, and he directly implicated the technology company's initial public offering as the motive for the extortion." "But what about the waiver itself?" David asked, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table. "She signed it. Does that give them any legal leverage at all?" Mr. Mitchell smiled a slow, predatory smile. "Absolutely none. The waiver Madeline signed is completely void. It is legally worthless." He opened one of the thick reference books on the table. "You cannot relinquish rights to an estate via a private unnotarized coffee shop agreement, especially when that agreement was obtained under documented duress. Furthermore, Richard does not legally own the estate he is trying to force her to abandon. The $40 million ironclad trust was established by her grandmother months before she passed. The assets bypassed probate entirely and vested immediately to Madeline upon her grandmother's death." I took a sip of my water, feeling a profound sense of tactical superiority. "So from a civil standpoint, the paper in his pocket is just expensive trash," I concluded. "Precisely," Mr. Mitchell agreed. "But from a criminal standpoint, it is the Holy Grail. By forcing you to sign that document, Richard has provided definitive prosecutable proof of criminal extortion. He crossed the line from a nasty family dispute into a federal felony. When we hand this audio recording to the authorities, alongside the forged bridge loan documents, we will demonstrate a continuous coordinated conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and extortion." David let out a harsh breath, running a hand through his hair. "And Richard thinks he won. He walked out of that cafe believing he'd just secured his son's entire future." I opened my laptop and connected it to the conference room monitors. Let us see exactly how confident they are right now. I pulled up Cameron's public social media profiles and the corporate press pages for Nexus Innovations. As a self-proclaimed tech visionary, My brother could never resist an opportunity to brag online. Sure enough, his feeds were completely illuminated with fresh updates posted within the last hour. "Look at this," I said, pointing to the large monitor on the wall. Cameron had just uploaded a high-definition video of himself standing in the penthouse office of his fake tech company. He was wearing a custom suit and holding a glass of champagne. The caption read, "Securing the future." "The bridge is built and the path to the IPO is crystal clear. See you all at the gala on Friday night." He posted that 20 minutes after my father left the coffee shop, David noted, shaking his head in disbelief. Richard must have called him the second he walked out the door to tell him the waiver was signed. I clicked over to my mother's public society pages. Patricia was equally active. She had just posted a series of photos showing floral arrangements and catering menus for the upcoming IPO gala. Her caption was dripping with maternal pride. "So incredibly blessed to watch my brilliant son change the world." The Nexus Innovations Launch Gala will be the event of the decade. Family is everything. "They are celebrating," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper. "They are toasting to their own brilliance. They think they successfully crushed the only obstacle standing between them and $150 million of venture capital money." Mr. Mitchell adjusted his glasses, studying the monitors. "Their arrogance is their greatest vulnerability. By lulling them into this false sense of absolute security, you have ensured they will not take any evasive actions. They are not hiding money. They are not destroying evidence. They are accelerating their timeline. They are walking straight toward the edge of the cliff with their eyes wide open." "We have 72 hours until the gala," David said, looking at the calendar on the wall. "What is our next move?" "We finalized the weapon," I replied, pulling up the encrypted dossier we had built the night before. "I need to format this evidence package so that the federal agents can digest it instantly. We have the forged will they gave the bank. We have the shell company registration signed by Patricia. We have the routing numbers proving they stole my startup funds 4 years ago to save Nexus Innovations from bankruptcy. And now we have the audio recording of Richard committing federal extortion to protect the bridge loan." I looked at Mr. Mitchell. "We need to tie the bow on this package. Can you draft a formal legal summary outlining the exact statutes they have violated? I want the federal prosecutor to have the indictment basically written for them before we even walk into the room." "Consider it done," Mr. Mitchell said, pulling his legal pad closer. "I will outline the violations of Title 18 United States Code, Section 1343 for wire fraud and Section 1344 for bank fraud. I will also include the extortion and coercion charges. It will be a comprehensive, undeniable roadmap to a federal conviction." I turned back to the monitors, watching a muted video of my brother smiling arrogantly for the camera. For 4 years, they had made me feel like a small, insignificant failure. They had isolated me, broken me down, and convinced the world that I was a fragile liability. They had stolen the man I loved and forced him to live in fear. They thought their wealth and their social standing made them untouchable gods. But gods do not leave paper trails. Gods do not sign fraudulent corporate documents. Gods do not leave audio recordings of their crimes. They are completely exposed, I said, staring at the digital faces of my family. They believe I am sitting in my apartment right now crying over a $10,000 check and packing my bags for an eviction. They have no idea that the daughter they threw away is sitting in a war room drafting their federal indictments. David placed a steady, reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You played the role perfectly, Madeline. You gave them exactly what they wanted to see. Now they are completely blind to what is actually coming." I closed the social media tabs and opened the secure file containing our federal dossier. The illusion of my surrender was the most powerful tactical maneuver we could have executed. It froze the battlefield entirely in our favor. Richard and Patricia were no longer fighting a war. They were simply planning a victory parade. "We have 3 days," I told the men in the room, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. 3 days to coordinate with the authorities and set the stage. We are not just going to stop their company from going public. We are going to ensure that when the federal agents walk into that ballroom on Friday night, there is nowhere for my family to run and no shadow left for them to hide in. The next 72 hours became a blur of relentless high-stakes calculation. Mr. Mitchell's private conference room was officially transformed from a legal office into a highly classified war room. We stripped the mahogany walls of their prestigious art prints and replaced them with massive corkboards. We used thick red markers and push pins to map out every single financial artery connecting my parents to their impending destruction. David took the lead on monitoring the digital chatter surrounding the initial public offering. He set up a tracking algorithm to monitor any shifts in Nexus Innovations' public filings. Every time Cameron released a new press statement or updated the investor prospectus, David documented the lie, adding it to a growing stack of perjury evidence. He worked with a quiet, intense focus driven by the need to clear his name and protect our future. I focused entirely on compiling the federal dossier. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how federal prosecutors thought. They did not want a messy, emotional family dispute. They wanted a clean, linear narrative of financial crime. I structured the evidence to read like a perfectly plotted thriller, where the ending resulted in mandatory minimum sentencing. First was the cornerstone of the entire fraud, the forged will. I placed a certified copy of the fake document right next to the original ironclad trust signed by my grandmother. The contrast was glaring. Next came the bridge loan application. I highlighted the exact page where Richard and Patricia pledged $40 million of assets they did not own to a federally insured bank. That single signature constituted massive bank fraud. Then I layered in the historical context. I printed the incorporation papers for Apex Holdings, LLC, featuring my mother's maiden name. I attached the wire transfer logs proving they stole my $450,000 startup fund to save Cameron's failing company 4 years ago. I connected the stolen funds directly to Nexus Innovations, proving that the very foundation of this highly anticipated tech empire was built on stolen money. Finally, the crown jewel of our arsenal was the extortion recording. I transferred the audio file onto 3 separate encrypted flash drives. Mr. Mitchell drafted a comprehensive legal transcript of the conversation, highlighting the specific timestamps where Richard explicitly threatened my career and demanded I sign a fraudulent waiver to protect the IPO. It was undeniable proof of coercion and conspiracy. By Thursday morning, the war room looked like the epicenter of a massive federal investigation. The dossier was complete. It was a dense, devastating weapon of absolute truth. But having the weapon was only half the battle. We needed to deploy it with surgical precision. We needed to control the timing of the explosion. We gathered around the main conference table, spreading out the promotional materials and the itinerary for the Nexus Innovations launch gala. The event was being held at the Grand Ballroom of the Harborview Hotel. It was designed to be a spectacle of extreme wealth and corporate triumph. Hundreds of venture capitalists, Wall Street analysts, and tech journalists were invited to witness the birth of a new billionaire. David pulled up the digital blueprints of the hotel ballroom on the main monitor. He had managed to access the event planner's public schedule, giving us a minute-by-minute breakdown of the evening. The cocktail reception would begin at 7, followed by a seated dinner at 8. But the crucial moment, the point of absolute no return, was scheduled for 9:30. At 9:30, Cameron is going to take the stage for his keynote address, David said, tracing a path on the digital blueprint. He will pitch the fake artificial intelligence platform to the investors in the room. Immediately after the speech, Richard is hosting a private signing ceremony in the VIP lounge adjacent to the main stage. That is where the lead venture capitalist will physically sign the $150 million funding agreements. Mr. Mitchell leaned forward, tapping his pen against the table. And to secure those agreements, Richard must hand over the finalized bridge loan documents, proving they have the $40 million in collateral to float the company until the IPO clears. The moment Richard places those forged collateral documents onto that table in front of the investors, the crime is fully executed. It transitions from a planned conspiracy to an active, committed federal fraud. I stared at the blueprint, my mind locking onto the timeline. We cannot strike during the cocktail hour, I stated firmly. If we confront them too early, Richard will just claim there was a misunderstanding with the estate and cancel the signing. He will find a way to spin the narrative and slip out the back door. We have to let them walk into the trap. We have to let them hand over the forged documents. We strike at exactly 9:35. I decided, circling the VIP lounge on the blueprint. We let Cameron finish his speech. We let the audience applaud. We let Richard pull out his fancy gold pen and lay the fraudulent papers on the table. And right as the investors reach out to sign their names, we drop the bomb. We cut the power to their presentation and we broadcast their crimes to the entire room. David looked at me, a fierce, protective pride shining in his eyes. It is going to be a bloodbath, Madeline. They are going to lose their minds when they see you standing there. I want them to lose their minds, I replied coldly. I want them to experience the exact same panic and humiliation they forced you to endure 4 years ago. I want Patricia to watch her social standing disintegrate in real time. I want Richard to realize that his corporate bullying just bought him a federal prison sentence. And I want Cameron to stand on that stage and realize he is nothing but a fraud. Mr. Mitchell closed his legal pad, a grim smile playing on his lips. I will contact the federal authorities first thing tomorrow morning. I have a direct line to the lead investigator at the White Collar Crime Division. When I present them with this dossier and inform them that a multi-million-dollar bank fraud is actively taking place at the Harborview Hotel, they will not just send a couple of detectives. They will send a fully armed federal strike team. The final night before the gala was incredibly quiet. The frantic energy of the past 3 days gave way to a heavy, intense stillness. We had done everything we could. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the timeline was locked. There was nothing left to do but wait. David and I returned to my apartment just after midnight. The space felt strange, almost foreign, after spending so much time in the war room. We sat on the small sofa in the dark, watching the city lights flicker through the living room window. The emotional weight of what we were about to do pressed down on us. We were about to permanently destroy my family. We were about to send my father and brother to prison. Are you absolutely sure about this? David asked softly, reaching over to take my hand. Once Mr. Mitchell makes that call tomorrow morning, there is no turning back. The FBI will take over. The indictments will be unsealed. Your parents will lose everything. I squeezed his hand tightly, drawing strength from his unwavering support. I am absolutely sure, David. They made their choice the day they decided my life was an acceptable casualty for their greed. They made their choice when they framed you and forced you to live in fear. They made their choice when they handed me a $45,000 invoice and told me to get off my grandmother's property. I looked out at the glowing skyline, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over my soul. This is not revenge, I whispered into the quiet room. This is an audit. They have been running a deficit of basic human decency for decades. Tomorrow night the bill finally comes due, and I am going to collect every single penny. I stood up and walked into my bedroom. Hanging on the closet door was the dress I had purchased specifically for the gala. I had used the black card linked to my grandmother's true trust to buy it. It was a breathtaking designer gown in a deep midnight blue, tailored to project absolute power and unshakable confidence. It was not the dress of a broken, bankrupt scapegoat. It was the armor of a woman who owned a $40 million empire. I laid out my accessories with meticulous care, my classic pearl earrings, a pair of elegant heels, and a sleek silver clutch purse that would hold the most important accessory of the evening, the encrypted flash drive containing the complete destruction of the Caldwell family legacy. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers up against the chill of the room. For the first time in 4 years, I did not struggle to fall asleep. My mind was not plagued by anxiety or feelings of worthlessness. The ghosts of my past had been completely exorcised. I closed my eyes and let the steady rhythm of David's breathing from the other room lull me into a deep, restful sleep. When I woke up on Friday morning, the sky was clear and bright. The countdown had officially reached its final hours. Mr. Mitchell made the call to the federal authorities at precisely 8 o'clock. By noon, the FBI had reviewed our digital dossier and confirmed the validity of the evidence. The wire fraud and the bank fraud were so blatant, so perfectly documented that the federal magistrates signed the arrest warrants without a moment of hesitation. The trap was fully armed. The authorities were mobilizing. My family was spending their day getting fitted for custom tuxedos and practicing their arrogant acceptance speeches, completely oblivious to the massive federal dragnet closing in around them. I spent the afternoon getting ready, moving with deliberate, terrifying calm. Every brush of makeup, every adjustment of my dress was a step closer to vindication. When David walked into the living room wearing a sharp, tailored suit, he looked like the successful, confident man I had married years ago. The shadows of his exile were gone, replaced by a fierce, commanding presence. "You look breathtaking," he said, offering me his arm. "Are you ready to go to a party?" I took his arm, gripping the silver clutch in my other hand. "I am ready," I replied. "Let us go show them what happens when you try to bury an accountant." We walked out of my apartment building and stepped into the crisp evening air. A sleek black town car was waiting by the curb, idling quietly. Mr. Mitchell was sitting in the back seat, his battered leather briefcase resting on his knees. David opened the door for me, and we slid onto the plush leather seats. As the driver pulled away from the curb, we did not head directly toward the Harbor View Hotel, where the gala was taking place. Instead, the car navigated through the winding streets of downtown Boston, heading toward a nondescript, brutalist government building located just 3 blocks away from the venue. The federal staging area. While Mr. Mitchell had made the initial phone calls to his contacts at the white-collar crime division that morning, we still needed to conduct the final tactical briefing. A case of this magnitude, involving a $150 million venture capital scheme and a $25 million fraudulent bank loan, required absolute precision. The authorities needed to verify the digital dossier in person and synchronize our watches for the takedown. The car descended into a secure underground parking garage. 2 men wearing dark suits and earpieces were waiting by a reinforced steel door. They checked Mr. Mitchell's identification before swiping keycards to grant us access. We walked down a sterile white hallway and entered a large windowless conference room. Sitting at the center of a metal table were 2 high-ranking federal officials. Special Agent Miller from the FBI stood up first. He was a tall, imposing man with sharp, calculating eyes. Beside him stood Director Lawson, a top enforcement official from the Securities and Exchange Commission. These were not local detectives easily swayed by my father's elite country club connections. These were federal apex predators who specialized in dismantling corporate empires. "Have a seat," Madeline, Special Agent Miller said, gesturing to the metal chairs. "Arthur has briefed us extensively on the situation, but before we execute a raid on a major corporate event, we need to review the exact mechanics of the fraud. We need to know that this trap is inescapable." I sat down, placing my silver clutch on the table. I opened it and retrieved the encrypted flash drive, sliding it across the metal surface. "I am a senior forensic accountant, Agent Miller. I do not deal in assumptions. I deal in absolute mathematical certainty." Director Lawson plugged the drive into a secure federal laptop. The files immediately populated on the large presentation screen at the front of the room. I stood up and walked toward the screen, stepping into my professional element. I pointed to the first document displaying the S1 registration statement Cameron had filed for Nexus Innovations. "My brother is currently soliciting $150 million from Wall Street venture capitalists." I began, my voice commanding and precise. To do this, he has presented financial disclosures claiming massive artificial intelligence supply chain revenue. Those disclosures are complete fabrications. He has utilized a layering technique, passing zero-value assets between shell companies to simulate cash flow. Because he is soliciting funds across state lines from investors in New York and California, this constitutes massive interstate wire fraud. Director Lawson nodded, his eyes scanning the data scrolling across the screen. "We have seen schemes like this before, but proving intent to defraud before the money changes hands can be legally tricky. A good defense attorney might claim your brother is simply a terrible businessman who made optimistic projections." "That is why the bridge loan is the kill shot," I replied, tapping a button to bring up the $25 million commercial loan origination document. "To fund the legal and administrative costs of this initial public offering. My father Richard and my mother Patricia secured a bridge loan from a federally insured bank," I explained. They needed massive collateral to secure $25 million. They used this. I pulled up the side-by-side comparison of the forged will and my grandmother's true ironclad trust document. I highlighted the glaring discrepancies in the signatures and the legal formatting. My parents submitted a forged document to a federally insured institution. I continued pacing slowly in front of the screen. They pledged $40 million of real estate and investment portfolios that they absolutely do not own. The true trust vests entirely to me. By submitting the fake will to secure capital for a fraudulent tech company, they have committed federal bank fraud. Special Agent Miller leaned forward, resting his elbows on the metal table. The forgery is blatant, but Richard is a powerful man. He could argue that he found the will and believed it to be genuine. He could claim he was acting in good faith as the grieving son trying to execute his mother's final wishes. I smiled a cold, sharp smile. I anticipated that defense. That is why I brought you this. I clicked the final file on the drive. It was the audio recording from the coffee shop. I pressed play. My father's booming, arrogant voice echoed off the concrete walls of the staging room. The federal agents sat in absolute silence as they listened to Richard explicitly threaten to destroy my career and bury me in defamation lawsuits if I did not sign a waiver relinquishing my rights to the estate. They listened as he directly tied the extortion to Cameron's impending IPO bridge loans, stating that he needed my signature to ensure the bank released the funds. When the recording ended, the heavy silence in the room was palpable. David was watching the agents, his arms crossed, his jaw set tight. He knew we had just handed them the perfect weapon. Special Agent Miller let out a low whistle, shaking his head. He just gift-wrapped his own federal indictment. The extortion charge removes any possibility of a good-faith defense. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he used criminal coercion to protect the bank fraud. We also have proof that Patricia signed the incorporation papers for the shell companies used to steal my startup funds 4 years ago, I added, pointing to the final exhibit on the screen. The entire family is complicit. It is a continuous, coordinated racketeering enterprise. Director Lawson turned to Agent Miller. The SEC can freeze every single asset associated with Nexus Innovations the moment the ink hits the paper. But we need the physical signing to happen. If we raid the gala before Richard hands over the final collateral agreements to the venture capitalists, they can claim it was just a proposal. We need the transaction to be fully executed. I pulled up the digital blueprint of the Harborview Hotel ballroom. That is exactly how we planned the timeline, I said, pointing to the VIP lounge adjacent to the main stage. Cameron is scheduled to deliver his keynote address at 9:30, I explained. Immediately following the applause, he and Richard are hosting a private signing ceremony in this lounge with the lead investors. They have to present the finalized bridge loan documents to prove they have the operational capital to survive until the IPO clears. I looked directly at Special Agent Miller. I am going to walk right into that ballroom. I am going to hijack the audio-visual system and project this entire dossier onto the main screens behind them. I am going to publicly confront them, forcing them to admit their lies in front of every single investor in the room. They will panic. They will try to scramble, and Richard will likely say something highly incriminating on an open microphone. Special Agent Miller stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. My tactical teams are already positioned at the Harborview Hotel. We have agents dressed as catering staff monitoring the service corridors. We have teams securing the loading docks and the underground parking garages. No one leaves that building tonight. He walked around the table and stopped directly in front of me. His piercing gaze searched my face, looking for any sign of hesitation or emotional fragility. You need to understand something, Madeline. When we breach those doors, this stops being a family dispute. Your father, your mother, and your brother will be placed in federal handcuffs. They will be facing decades in a federal penitentiary. They will be stripped of their wealth and their freedom. Are you absolutely certain you can stand on that stage and pull the trigger on your own blood? I met his gaze with absolute, icy resolve. My parents stole my life savings to save their golden child. They framed my husband and forced him to live like a fugitive for 4 years. They evicted me from my home, handed me a bill for a funeral they stole from me, and threatened to destroy the only career I have left. They stopped being my family a long time ago, Agent Miller. Today I am just a forensic accountant executing an audit. Special Agent Miller nodded, a look of deep professional respect crossing his features. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick stack of folded papers. He placed them on the metal table. These are the federal arrest warrants, he stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Signed by a federal magistrate judge, 20 minutes ago. The charges include wire fraud, bank fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. The trap is fully armed. David stepped up beside me, his presence a steady grounding force. We have 20 minutes until Cameron takes the stage, he noted, checking his watch. It is time to go. Mr. Mitchell packed his briefcase, his hands moving with quiet dignity. He had spent years watching my grandmother suffer under the weight of her son's corruption. Tonight, he was finally helping to deliver the justice she had meticulously engineered. Director Lawson closed the secure laptop and handed the encrypted flash drive back to me. Good luck, Madeline. We will be listening to your audio feed. The moment you corner them on that stage, we move in. I slipped the flash drive back into my silver clutch, closing it with a definitive snap. The adrenaline coursing through my veins was electric, wiping away any lingering traces of exhaustion or fear. We walked out of the federal staging room, leaving the stark concrete walls behind, and stepped back into the waiting town car. The short drive to the Harborview Hotel felt like moving through a dream. The city lights blurred against the wet windows, casting golden reflections across the dark leather interior of the car. We pulled up to the grand entrance of the hotel, where valets in sharp uniforms were opening doors for men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns. The entire Boston elite had gathered to worship at the altar of my family's fabricated success. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting my face. David offered me his arm, his eyes burning with the same fierce protective energy that had kept him going for 4 long years. Mr. Mitchell walked a few paces behind us, holding the briefcase that contained the true $40 million trust. I looked up at the towering facade of the Harborview Hotel. My parents were inside, basking in the flashbulbs, believing they were untouchable gods. They had no idea that the federal government was already inside their fortress, and they had no idea that their discarded daughter was walking through the front doors, holding the detonator that would reduce their empire to ash. "Let us go," I said, squeezing David's arm. We walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the dazzling light of the lobby. The final reckoning had officially begun. The lobby of the Harborview Hotel was a masterpiece of gilded excess. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across polished marble floors, and towering floral arrangements scented the air with an oppressive sweetness. We walked past the concierge desk, our footsteps moving in perfect synchronization. Security personnel in dark suits flanked the entrance to the main grand ballroom, but as we approached, I noticed the subtle earpieces and the rigid tactical posture that marked them as federal agents rather than private hotel security. Special Agent Miller's team was already deeply embedded. One of the agents made brief eye contact with Mr. Mitchell and offered a nearly imperceptible nod, stepping aside to grant us unimpeded access to the double doors. The muffled sound of a roaring crowd bled through the heavy mahogany wood. We paused just outside the ballroom. I smoothed the fabric of my midnight blue designer gown. It fit like a second skin, radiating the kind of undeniable power that only generationally secured wealth could provide. David adjusted his tie, his jaw set with iron resolve. We waited for the applause to die down, listening intently to the muffled voice echoing from the speakers inside. It was Cameron. My younger brother was working the crowd. I gestured to the agent to crack the door just enough for us to see inside without being noticed. The ballroom was spectacular. Tables draped in black silk filled the massive space, surrounded by hundreds of high-net-worth investors, Wall Street analysts, and tech journalists. Waiters poured vintage champagne into crystal flutes. At the far end of the room, a massive, brightly lit stage dominated the space. 2 enormous digital screens flanked the podium, displaying the sleek, modern logo of Nexus Innovations. Cameron paced back and forth across the stage, wearing a wireless microphone headset like a seasoned tech guru. He gestured expansively, pitching his fraudulent artificial intelligence platform with nauseating confidence. Sitting in the front row right at the edge of the stage were my parents. Richard and Patricia looked like absolute royalty. My mother wore a shimmering silver evening gown, her hair styled flawlessly, smiling with profound maternal pride. My father sat beside her, projecting the image of a titan of industry, successfully passing the torch to his genius heir. They were soaking in the adulation, perfectly content in the knowledge that they had built this glorious moment by destroying my life and stealing my future. Cameron raised his hands to quiet a fresh round of polite laughter from the audience. "We are not just building a logistics company today," he declared, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. "We are building a legacy of transparency, innovation, and trust. That is the Caldwell family way." I looked at David. I looked at Mr. Mitchell. The hypocrisy of my brother's words hung in the air, a pathetic lie begging to be shattered. I placed my hands flat against the heavy mahogany doors. "Now," I said, pushing them wide open. The heavy doors swung outward with a loud, resonant thud that echoed sharply at the back of the silent, attentive ballroom. I stepped through the threshold, the brilliant spotlight from the stage reflecting off the silver clutch in my hand. David walked perfectly in step beside me, his presence radiating unshakable authority. Mr. Mitchell flanked us on the right, holding the battered briefcase that contained my grandmother's true $40 million estate. The sudden noise at the back of the room caused the attendees seated at the rear tables to turn around. As I began my slow, deliberate march down the long center aisle, the reaction rippled forward like a wave. Heads turned, whispers erupted. The elite crowd of investors and journalists murmured in deep confusion as they took in my appearance. I was not supposed to be here. To the few who knew the family, I was the disgraced, bankrupt sister who had supposedly suffered a mental breakdown and fled overseas. To the rest, I was an entirely unexpected disruption, radiating a terrifying level of confidence. My midnight blue gown commanded the space. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured pace of an executioner ascending the scaffold. It took exactly 10 seconds for the ripple of murmurs to reach the front row. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead, focused entirely on the stage. I watched the exact moment my mother turned her head to see what was causing the commotion. Patricia's pristine silver-clad posture instantly dissolved. The smug maternal pride melted off her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the polished floor, sending glass and expensive wine splashing across her designer shoes. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes widening as if she were looking at a ghost. She grabbed Richard's arm, digging her manicured nails into his tuxedo jacket. My father turned around, his annoyed expression morphing into absolute panic. He practically leaped out of his chair, his face draining of all color when he saw David walking proudly by my side. The man he had framed, blackmailed, and exiled 4 years ago was back standing in the center of his exclusive gala, completely unafraid. Up on the stage, Cameron stopped mid-sentence. His arrogant, confident stride faltered. He stared down the center aisle, his mouth hanging slightly open, the wireless microphone capturing his sharp intake of breath. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming train. He desperately looked to our parents for guidance, but Richard and Patricia were completely paralyzed by shock. I continued my march down the center aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The murmurs in the crowd escalated into audible gasps and urgent whispering. Venture capitalists leaned across their tables, asking their associates who the woman in the midnight blue dress was and why the CEO looked like he was about to faint. 2 private hotel security guards positioned near the stage quickly stepped forward, moving to intercept us before we could reach the front. They reached out to grab my arms. Before they could even make contact, 2 waiters dropped their silver serving trays and stepped directly into the path of the guards. The waiters flashed federal badges hidden inside their jackets, silently warning the private security to stand down. The hotel guards immediately backed away, raising their hands in surrender. The realization that federal agents were actively facilitating my entrance sent a visible shockwave through the front tables. Richard saw the badges. I watched my father's chest heave as the devastating reality of his situation began to dawn on him. He realized this was not just a dramatic family stunt. He realized his corporate security could not protect him, but his massive, arrogant ego refused to accept total defeat. He tried to salvage the unraveling illusion. He forced a sickeningly fake smile onto his face and stepped out into the center aisle, blocking my path to the stage. "Madeline." "What a wonderful surprise," my father announced, projecting his voice so the nearby investors could hear. He tried to sound like a welcoming patriarch, but his voice shook with poorly concealed terror. "We thought you were still working overseas. Please come sit with your mother. We can discuss your unexpected return privately in the VIP lounge after the keynote presentation." He reached out to grab my elbow, his fingers trembling with rage and desperation. He was trying to herd me into the side room, trying to trap me behind closed doors where he could threaten me again. I stopped walking. I stood 3 feet away from the man who had systematically destroyed my life. I did not lower my voice. I did not play along with his pathetic charade. I looked down at his outstretched hand and then looked directly into his terrified eyes. "Do not touch me, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. My father recoiled as if he had been physically struck. He glanced nervously at the investors sitting just feet away, who were now watching the confrontation with intense scrutiny. "Madeline, please," he hissed, his voice dropping to a frantic, venomous whisper. "You are going to ruin the IPO. I gave you the $10,000. You signed the waiver. What do you think you are doing here? Get out of this ballroom right now before I have you arrested for trespassing." David stepped forward, inserting himself between me and my father. Richard took a hasty step back, his eyes darting to the man he had ruthlessly framed. "You are not having anyone arrested, Richard," David said, his voice dripping with cold authority. "You do not have the power to intimidate us anymore. Your threats are as worthless as your son's company." On the stage, Cameron was frantically tapping the side of his headset, trying to signal the audio-visual technicians in the sound booth to cut the lights or play music. He was desperate to create a distraction. But the technicians in the booth had already been quietly replaced by Special Agent Miller's Cyber Division team. The room remained brightly lit. The spotlight remained fixed on the stage. There was nowhere to hide. Patricia rushed forward from the front row, her silver gown sweeping across the floor. She grabbed my father's arm and glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "How dare you show your face here?" she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "How dare you bring this criminal back into our lives? You are a jealous, bitter failure, Madeline. You could not stand to see your brother succeed, so you came here to throw a tantrum. Security will throw you out." I looked at my mother, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical detachment. She was clutching her pearls, clinging to her fabricated reality, even as the walls collapsed around her. I stepped around my parents, ignoring their frantic whispers entirely. I walked past the front row of stunned Wall Street executives and approached the short set of stairs leading up to the main stage. Cameron backed away as I climbed the steps, his eyes wide with panic. "Maddie, what are you doing?" he stammered, covering the microphone with his hand. "Get off the stage. This is my company. This is my night." I reached the center of the stage, standing directly under the brilliant white spotlight. I turned to face the massive ballroom, looking out over the sea of wealthy investors and hungry journalists. I opened my sleek silver clutch and pulled out the encrypted flash drive, holding it up for the entire room to see. "This is not your night, Cameron," I said, my voice perfectly calm and resonant, "and this is certainly not your company." I turned toward the audiovisual booth at the back of the room and gave a sharp, definitive nod. It was time to execute the audit. The massive digital screens behind Cameron flickered and went entirely black. A sudden, uneasy hush fell over the hundreds of elite venture capitalists and tech journalists in the ballroom. Cameron, realizing that the polished illusion of his launch gala was rapidly disintegrating, spun around in a blind panic. He frantically motioned to his corporate legal team, who were hovering near the lead investors at the VIP tables stationed right at the edge of the stage. "Sign the contracts right now," Cameron shouted, his voice cracking as he pointed to the thick leather-bound stacks of $150 million funding agreements. Do not pay attention to this intrusion. She is just a disgruntled, mentally unstable relative trying to cause a scene. Execute the term sheets, and we will have security remove her immediately. The lead investors in their bespoke suits hesitated. They held their expensive fountain pens poised over the signature lines, exchanging uncertain glances. I walked directly to the clear acrylic podium and pulled the main microphone from its stand. If you sign those contracts, gentlemen, my voice boomed through the state-of-the-art sound system, echoing with cold, absolute authority. You will be permanently anchoring your investment firms to a massive, unmitigated federal bank fraud. The lead investor from a prominent New York venture capital firm slowly lowered his pen. His eyes locked onto me with sudden, intense scrutiny. Cameron lunged toward me, trying to snatch the microphone away. David was there in a fraction of a second, stepping smoothly between us and shoving my brother back. Cameron stumbled, his expensive custom suit rumpling as he nearly fell over the microphone cords. I am a senior forensic accountant, I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy tension of the ballroom. For the past 72 hours, I have been conducting a deep-level zero open-book audit of Nexus Innovations. My brother has stood on this stage tonight and promised you a revolutionary logistics platform generating massive recurring revenue. He is lying to you. I looked toward the audio-visual booth at the back of the room. Put it on the screen. The twin massive projector screens behind the stage suddenly flared back to life. They did not display the sleek, futuristic logo of my brother's company. Instead, they displayed raw, unredacted financial spreadsheets. The glaring rows of data stretched across the screens, illuminating the dark ballroom with the undeniable light of cold, hard facts. Look at the screens behind me, I commanded, pointing to the data. These are the actual bank routing numbers and transaction logs for Nexus Innovations. I have stripped away the proprietary shell companies and the offshore holding accounts they use to layer the capital. You are looking at the raw operational balance sheet. Nexus Innovations has absolutely zero generated revenue. They do not have a functional product line. They do not possess a single paying client. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers. Analysts began pulling out their tablets frantically, trying to cross-reference the routing numbers displayed on the massive screens. The capital you see moving through their ledgers is a highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme, I explained, methodically breaking down the fraud for the financial experts in the room. Cameron has been taking bridge loan capital, transferring it through dummy corporations registered in Delaware, and logging it as generated logistics revenue. He is inflating the corporate valuation using your own anticipated investment money as the foundational metric. This company is a complete shell. It is a ghost ship built entirely on fraudulent accounting. Shut her up! Richard roared from the front row, his face purple with rage. He slammed his fists against the VIP table, overturning a crystal water pitcher. Turn off those screens right now. This is corporate espionage. She hacked our systems and altered the data. I turned my gaze down to my father, staring at him with absolute clinical detachment. I did not alter the data, Richard. I simply followed the money. And that brings us to the bridge loan. I nodded to the booth again. The screens shifted instantly. The raw spreadsheets were replaced by a high-definition scan of a $25 million commercial loan origination document from a major federally insured bank. The gasps from the front row were audible. The investors recognized the bank logo immediately. To fund the legal and administrative costs of this initial public offering, my father and my brother required massive upfront capital. I told the room, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. They secured a $25 million bridge loan 48 hours ago. But to secure a loan of that magnitude from a federally insured institution, you must provide tangible, unencumbered collateral. The screen zoomed in on the collateral schedule attached to the loan document. The list of assets was displayed in bold black text for every Wall Street executive to read. As you can see on the collateral schedule, my parents pledged $40 million worth of real estate and investment portfolios to the bank, I said, pacing slowly across the stage, owning every inch of the space. They pledged a historic Beacon Hill mansion, a Martha's Vineyard estate, and several high-yield commercial properties. They presented a final will and testament to the loan officers, claiming that my brother Cameron was the sole beneficiary of my late grandmother's estate. Patricia let out a piercing, hysterical scream from the floor. "You jealous, vindictive liar! Get off that stage! You are ruining your brother's life." "I am not ruining his life," I responded, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. "I am auditing it, because the will you submitted to the bank is a complete forgery." The murmurs in the crowd morphed into outright shouts of shock. The lead investors standing at the VIP tables stepped back, their faces registering the profound legal danger they were currently standing in. I gestured to the screens one final time. "Show them the truth." The visual on the massive screens split perfectly in half. On the left side was the forged will my parents had presented to the bank. On the right side was the authentic ironclad trust document drafted by Mr. Mitchell, complete with the heavy red wax seals and the official notarized signatures. The side-by-side comparison was utterly devastating. The fraudulent document looked like amateur child's play next to the legally binding trust. "The document on the left is the forgery my family used to commit federal bank fraud," I announced, letting the words ring out with absolute finality. "The document on the right is the true, irrevocable living trust established by my grandmother months before she passed away. It bypasses probate entirely. And as you can clearly read in Section 4, my grandmother explicitly disinherited my father, my mother, and my brother. She left the entirety of the $40 million estate solely to me." The silence that fell over the ballroom was absolute. The sheer scale of the deception was too massive for anyone to immediately process. I had just proven in front of the most powerful financial figures on the East Coast that the Caldwell family owned absolutely nothing. Their wealth was a fabrication. Their tech empire was a mirage. They had attempted to steal $150 million using a forged document to mortgage a mansion they did not even own. "My parents are entirely bankrupt." I continued, driving the final nail into the coffin of their legacy. "They stole my life savings 4 years ago to save Cameron from going to prison for his first failed startup. They framed my husband. They evicted me from my home. They threatened to destroy my career. They did all of this to maintain the pathetic illusion of their own superiority." I looked directly at the lead venture capitalists hovering near the VIP tables. "If you sign those agreements tonight, your funds will immediately be seized by the federal government as part of an active criminal investigation. You will be tying your client's money to a family that has committed interstate wire fraud, extortion, and bank fraud." The lead investor from New York looked at the massive screens and then looked down at the thick, leather-bound contracts sitting on the table. He did not say a single word. He simply dropped his expensive gold fountain pen onto the table. The sharp metallic clatter echoed loudly in the quiet room. Without breaking eye contact with my father, the investor took a deliberate step backward, physically distancing himself from the documents. The other investors immediately followed suit. They dropped their pens, left their portfolios on the chairs, and backed away from the tables in absolute disgust. The deal was dead. The $150 million initial public offering evaporated into thin air. Cameron dropped to his knees on the stage, burying his face in his hands. The arrogant, confident tech visionary was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, trembling fraud who realized his entire life was over. His wireless microphone picked up the sound of his rapid, panicked breathing, broadcasting his humiliation to the entire room. "You have destroyed us," Patricia wailed from the floor, her silver gown pooling around her as she clung to the edge of the VIP table. "You have taken everything from your own family. You are a monster." "I am an accountant," I corrected her, my voice devoid of any sympathy. "I just balanced the ledger." Richard stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes wide with a terror he had never experienced in his entire life. The untouchable corporate titan was realizing that his wealth, his reputation, and his power had just been publicly, meticulously slaughtered by the daughter he had spent decades treating like garbage. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, searching for someone to believe his lies. But the wealthy elite crowd was already turning their backs on him. The journalists were frantically typing on their phones, uploading the scandal of the decade to their news networks. The venture capitalists were calling their legal teams demanding immediate damage control. The Caldwell family was officially radioactive. I stood under the bright spotlight holding the silver clutch that contained their destruction. I had exposed every lie. I had dismantled every facade. I had ripped away the curtain and forced the world to look at the ugly, greedy truth hiding behind their perfect smiles. The public dismantling was absolutely complete. But the night was not over yet. The final phase of the audit was about to begin. The silence following the destruction of the venture capital deal was fragile, hanging by a microscopic thread in the massive ballroom. Patricia was the one who finally snapped it. Seeing her entire, carefully constructed universe of wealth and elite status collapsing right in front of her eyes, she scrambled off the floor, grabbing a secondary microphone from the edge of the VIP table. Her hands were shaking so violently that the microphone emitted a sharp, piercing feedback squeal, causing the investors in the front row to wince and cover their ears in extreme discomfort. "Liar," she shrieked, her voice echoing with a raw, hysterical desperation that completely stripped away decades of her cultivated high society poise. "Do not listen to a single word she says. My daughter is a jealous, pathological liar. She has been deeply unstable for years. She hacked into these screens. She fabricated every single piece of data you are looking at because she is utterly obsessed with destroying her brother." Patricia pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me from the floor. "You are nothing but a bankrupt failure, Madeline. You could not keep a husband. You could not build a real career, so you came here to sabotage ours. These investors are not stupid. They know a desperate smear campaign when they see one. We have the real trust. We have the collateral. Cameron is a genius, and you are just a pathetic, bitter outcast trying to steal his glory." She looked wildly at the venture capitalists, pleading with them, using her best country club smile, but the smile looked grotesque, layered over her sheer panic. "Gentlemen, please do not let this deranged girl interrupt the signing. We can proceed to a private suite and finalize the paperwork right now." I watched my mother unravel with absolute clinical detachment. She was still trying to sell a burned-down house to people who could clearly see the smoke. I did not raise my voice to argue with her. I did not defend my character or my sanity. I simply tapped the side of my own microphone and looked toward the back of the room where Special Agent Miller's cyber team was stationed in the audio-visual booth. "I think it is time we let Richard speak for himself," I said calmly. "Play the audio." The massive digital screens behind the stage shifted from the side-by-side document comparison to a simple black screen displaying a pulsing, bright blue audio waveform. The ballroom speakers crackled for a fraction of a second before my father's booming, arrogant baritone filled the cavernous space. It was the recording from the coffee shop playing at maximum volume for the entire financial elite of Boston to hear. "Let me make this incredibly simple for you, Richards," recorded voice thundered from the overhead speakers. "You take this check and you sign that waiver right now. If you refuse, I will personally ensure you never work in the financial sector again. I will make one phone call to the board of directors at your firm, and you will be terminated by 5 o'clock today." The color drained instantly from Richard's face. He stared up at the speakers, his mouth opening and closing in mute horror as his own vicious words condemned him. The recording continued mercilessly, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. "Cameron is launching a multi-million-dollar technology initial public offering this Friday. He needs the estate assets unencumbered by petty family litigation to secure his bridge loans. Your grandmother understood this. That is why she left the estate to him." The collective gasp from the ballroom was deafening. The investors, who had already backed away from the tables, now looked at Richard with profound, absolute disgust. The recording was the undeniable smoking gun. It proved malicious intent. It proved criminal coercion. It proved that Richard knew the estate was contested and was actively using corporate extortion to force his daughter to abandon her legal rights just to secure a fraudulent bank loan. "Turn it off!" Richard bellowed, finally finding his voice. He scrambled onto the stage, rushing toward the podium in a blind panic. Turn off that audio right now." But the audio kept playing, filling every corner of the room with the toxic reality of the Caldwell family. The recording captured the exact moment I asked for a pen and signed the document, followed by Richard's smug, chillingly arrogant farewell. "Smart girl. I always knew you had a pragmatic side. You have 72 hours to clear your remaining belongings out of the guest cottage." When the audio finally clicked off, the silence that followed was suffocating. Every single journalist in the room had their phone raised, recording the entire exchange. The corporate titan was completely exposed as a petty, ruthless thug. Richard spun around looking for an exit. His eyes darted toward the service doors near the back of the stage, calculating an escape route. But before he could even take a single step, the heavy main doors of the Harborview Hotel ballroom burst open with a violent, resounding crash. Federal Agent Special Agent Miller's voice roared over the chaos, commanding absolute authority. "Nobody move!" Dozens of agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with FBI emblazoned in bold yellow letters across their backs flooded into the ballroom. They moved with terrifying speed and precision, fanning out across the room and securing every single exit. The wealthy attendees scrambled out of the way, pressing themselves against the silk-draped tables as the strike team marched directly down the center aisle. Agent Miller led the charge. His eyes locked onto the stage. He did not look at the investors. He did not look at the press. He walked straight past David and me, ascending the short stairs to the stage, with two heavily armed agents flanking him. Richard Caldwell. Cameron Caldwell, Agent Miller, announced, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and federal extortion." Richard tried to back away, raising his hands in a pathetic display of surrender. Wait, you do not understand. This is a family matter. My daughter is confused. Let me call my lawyers. We can clear this up in 5 minutes." An agent grabbed Richard's arms, twisting them firmly behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting tight echoed loudly over the murmuring crowd. "You have the right to remain silent." Agent Miller began reciting the Miranda warning with cold, mechanical precision. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." On the other side of the stage, Cameron was completely hyperventilating. He dropped to his knees before the agents even touched him, sobbing uncontrollably. He offered no resistance as they pulled his arms behind his back and secured his wrists. The self-proclaimed tech visionary, the genius CEO who was supposed to change the world, was currently weeping on the floor of his own launch gala, begging the federal agents not to hurt him. "Dad, do something!" Cameron wailed, his voice cracking with pure terror as an agent hoisted him to his feet. "Tell them it was your idea. Tell them I did not know the will was fake. You promised me I would not go to jail. You promised me." Richard glared at his son, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and profound humiliation. "Shut your mouth, Cameron," he snapped, but his authority was completely gone. He was just an old, desperate man in handcuffs. The journalists in the room were having a field day. Camera flashes illuminated the stage like a strobe light, capturing every agonizing second of the Caldwell family downfall. The images of the prominent Boston billionaire and his golden child son being marched off the stage in federal restraints would be splashed across the front page of every major financial newspaper in the country by morning. Down on the floor, Patricia watched the entire scene unfold in a state of catatonic shock. Her world, her entire carefully constructed universe of wealth status and elite privilege, was evaporating right in front of her eyes. She watched the federal agents escort her husband and her favorite son down the center aisle. She saw the wealthy investors, the people whose approval she had craved her entire life, turning their backs on her, whispering in disgusted tones. She saw the society influencers pulling out their phones to live stream her complete destruction. She was officially an outcast. The bank would seize the Beacon Hill mansion by Monday morning. The offshore accounts would be permanently frozen by the SEC. The country club memberships would be immediately revoked. She had absolutely nothing left. Patricia slowly turned her head and looked up at me. I was still standing at the clear acrylic podium, the undisputed master of the room. My midnight blue gown looked immaculate under the bright lights. David stood by my side, a silent, impenetrable guardian, protecting my flank. Mr. Mitchell watched from the edge of the stage, holding the briefcase that contained the true $40 million estate. The reality of her situation finally broke through Patricia's manic delusion. The daughter she had thrown away, the daughter she had emotionally tortured and financially ruined, was now the only person on earth who held the keys to her survival. Patricia stumbled forward, her silver gown dragging heavily across the floor. She practically crawled up the short stairs to the stage, her movements clumsy and desperate. She reached the podium and collapsed, completely falling to her knees right in front of me. The proud, arrogant matriarch who had whispered venom into my ear at my grandmother's funeral just days ago was now groveling at my feet in front of hundreds of people. Her perfect hair was disheveled. Her expensive makeup was smeared from crying. She reached out with trembling hands, grabbing the hem of my designer dress. "Madeline, please." Patricia sobbed, her voice a wet, ragged plea that echoed through the ballroom microphone I was still holding. "Please, Madeline, you have to stop this. You have to tell them it is a mistake." I looked down at her, feeling a profound, chilling emptiness. I did not feel pity. I did not feel sorrow. I just observed her like a scientist studying a particularly fascinating specimen. "They are going to take your father away," Patricia wailed, gripping my dress tighter, tears streaming down her ruined face. "They are going to put Cameron in prison. He will not survive in there, Madeline. He is your little brother. You cannot let them do this to him." I remained perfectly still. I did not reach down to comfort her. I did not step away. I simply let her cry. "Please, Madeline, I am begging you," Patricia pleaded, pressing her forehead against my knees. "We are family. We share the same blood. I carried you. I raised you. I know we made mistakes. I know we were harsh, but we can fix this. We can give you the estate. We can give you everything. Just tell the FBI to drop the charges. Tell them it was a misunderstanding over the inheritance. You have the power to save us. Please save your family." The entire ballroom was completely silent save for the pathetic sound of my mother's weeping. Everyone was watching, waiting to see if the wealthy, abused daughter would finally crack under the weight of maternal guilt. They were waiting to see if the lifelong conditioning of family loyalty would override my demand for justice. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I thought about the 4 years of agonizing depression I suffered because of her lies. I thought about David packing a suitcase in the middle of the night, terrified for my life. I thought about the $45,000 funeral invoice she had Cameron hand me with a smirk. I slowly reached down and took hold of Patricia's wrists. Her eyes lit up with a sudden, desperate flash of hope, believing she had finally broken through my defenses. I firmly but gently peeled her fingers off the fabric of my dress, letting her hands drop back to her sides. I leaned forward, bringing my face close to hers so she could see the absolute, unrelenting ice in my eyes. I spoke clearly into the microphone, ensuring every single person in the room heard my final judgment. "This family died the day you threw me out. I am just taking out the trash." The words cut through the dead silence of the ballroom like a scythe. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I delivered the verdict with the cold, absolute finality of a judge handing down a death sentence. Patricia gasped as if the air had been physically punched from her lungs. Her hands slipped from the fabric of my midnight blue gown, leaving her to collapse entirely against the hard wooden floor of the stage. The illusion of the loving mother, the desperate matriarch trying to hold her world together, vanished completely. She was just a hollow shell of greed and vanity, sobbing uncontrollably under the harsh glare of the spotlight. She reached out one last trembling hand toward me, her manicured fingers grasping at empty air, but I had already turned away. I did not offer her a second glance. I turned my back on her, leaving her weeping at the feet of the federal agents who were now moving in to secure the crime scene. I stepped down from the podium and walked across the stage. David met me halfway, his hand finding mine. His grip was warm, steady, and filled with profound protective pride. We walked down the stairs and back into the center aisle. Mr. Mitchell fell into step beside us, his leather briefcase swinging gently by his side. The crowd of investors and journalists parted for us like the Red Sea. No one spoke a word to us. They simply watched in awed, terrified silence as we marched out of the grand ballroom. We pushed through the heavy mahogany doors and stepped back into the opulent hotel lobby, leaving the chaotic symphony of flashing cameras, shouting federal agents, and my mother's hysterical wailing behind us. We walked out of the Harborview Hotel and into the crisp Boston night. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal transport vans reflected off the wet pavement, illuminating the street with a frantic, chaotic energy. My father and brother were already being loaded into separate vehicles, their heads pushed down by agents to avoid the swarming paparazzi. I did not stop to watch them go. I simply took a deep breath of the cold, clean air, feeling a monumental, crushing weight permanently lift from my shoulders. The audit was officially complete. The debt was settled. The fallout from the gala was absolute and merciless. The media coverage over the next 6 months was relentless. The Caldwell family fraud became the biggest financial scandal of the decade, dominating news cycles and financial broadcasts. The prosecution did not even need to offer a plea deal. The evidence we provided, the forged collateral documents, the shell company routing numbers, and the pristine audio recording of the extortion, was so overwhelming that a federal jury returned a guilty verdict in record time. Richard was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for conspiracy, wire fraud, and extortion. During the sentencing hearing, the arrogant corporate titan who once threatened to destroy my career from across a coffee shop table was completely stripped of his bespoke suits and his power. He stood before the judge in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, looking old, fragile, and utterly defeated. He would spend the rest of his life sitting in a concrete cell, stripped of his name, his authority, and his precious reputation. Cameron received a 15-year sentence. The self-proclaimed tech visionary crumbled entirely during the trial. He sobbed openly in the courtroom, begging the judge for leniency. He tried to blame our father for everything, but my forensic paper trail proved he was completely complicit in the theft of my startup funds. The golden child was finally forced to face the harsh reality of his own profound incompetence without his parents' stolen money to shield him from the consequences. Patricia avoided a federal prison sentence by doing exactly what I expected her to do. She turned state's evidence against her own husband and son. It was a final desperate act of self-preservation that surprised absolutely no one. She handed over every secret she had to save herself. But keeping her physical freedom did not save her from total annihilation. The Securities and Exchange Commission froze every single asset tied to the fraud. The bank immediately foreclosed on the Beacon Hill mansion and the Martha's Vineyard estate. All of her offshore accounts were seized and dismantled. She was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. The Boston elite, the high society circle she had sacrificed her own daughter to impress, completely ostracized her. Her country club memberships were publicly revoked. Her former friends pretended they did not know her crossing the street to avoid her if they saw her walking. Patricia was forced to move into a cramped, dark studio apartment in a rough industrial neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. She had to sell off her remaining designer shoes and handbags just to pay her utility bills. She eventually took a minimum wage job working the reception desk at a local dry cleaner. The woman who once stood in a ballroom, wrapped in silver silk and pearls demanding absolute obedience, was now completely invisible, a pathetic ghost haunting the very city she once thought she ruled. She had chased status so blindly that she ran straight off a cliff. With the criminal trials concluded and the fraudulent will permanently voided, the probate courts officially recognized my grandmother's ironclad trust. I took the helm of the $40 million estate not as a vengeful heir, but as a meticulous guardian of her true legacy. I liquidated the toxic commercial assets my father had polluted and reinvested the massive capital into clean, sustainable ventures. I established a series of charitable foundations in my grandmother's name, focusing specifically on providing emergency legal and financial resources for victims of domestic financial abuse. I made sure that no one else would ever be trapped the way I had been. But I did not stop there. The war I had fought alongside David had revealed a massive, glaring vulnerability in the corporate and legal systems. There were thousands of people out there whose own families were actively destroying their lives through hidden accounts, forged documents, and sophisticated financial manipulation. They needed someone who understood the battlefield. They needed someone who knew exactly how the predators thought. They needed a predator of their own. David and I opened a highly specialized boutique forensic accounting and legal strategy firm right in the heart of the Boston financial district. We combined my elite auditing capabilities with his brilliant operational architecture. We did not take standard corporate clients. We specialized exclusively in prosecuting family financial abuse. We became the absolute worst nightmare for corrupt patriarchs, greedy siblings, and manipulative matriarchs who thought they could use bloodlines as a shield for corporate theft. We tracked hidden trusts, uncovered offshore routing numbers, and dismantled fraudulent estates with cold, terrifying efficiency. We were ruthless, incredibly effective, and wildly successful. Our shared trauma had transformed into an unbreakable partnership. The shadows that had haunted David for 4 years were completely gone. The guilt and fear that my father had forced him to carry evaporated the moment the federal handcuffs clicked around Richard's wrists. David was whole again, projecting a fierce protective energy that made our firm an impenetrable fortress. We were no longer defined by the people who tried to destroy us. We were defined by the empire we built from their ashes. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new penthouse office, looking out over the sprawling Boston skyline. The afternoon sun reflected off the glass towers, casting a brilliant golden light across the city. The office was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the city far below and the soft clicking of a keyboard. Behind me, David was sitting at our massive mahogany conference table, reviewing the intake files for a new high-profile client. He looked up, catching my reflection in the glass, and offered a warm, brilliant smile. I smoothed the fabric of my tailored designer suit, pressing my hand against the cool glass of the window. I felt the steady, powerful rhythm of my own heart. I thought about the terrified, broken woman I was 4 years ago, sitting in a cheap motel room, believing my life was over. I thought about the cold, manipulative family that had tried to bury me alive to protect their own insatiable greed. They had taken everything from me. They had stripped me down to my absolute core, attempting to leave me with nothing but shame. But they had forgotten one crucial detail. When you strip an accountant down to the absolute core, you are left with nothing but the raw, undeniable math. I had calculated the exact cost of my survival. I had balanced the ledger. I had taken their greatest weapon, their hubris, and turned it into the instrument of their total destruction. I looked down at the bustling streets below, feeling a profound, limitless sense of peace. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the victim waiting for the next blow to fall. I was the architect of my own empire, and the view from the top was absolutely breathtaking. I was wealthy, I was free, and I was entirely perfectly victorious. Family is often presented as an unbreakable bond, but shared DNA does not automatically excuse systemic mistreatment. The narratives we have explored reveal a stark universal truth: your worth is never determined by someone else's inability to see it. Whether you are explicitly excluded from significant family milestones because you do not fit a perfect socially acceptable mold, or you are manipulated by relatives seeking to control your financial future, toxic dynamics thrive on your silence and compliance. The turning point in overcoming familial emotional abuse is recognizing that you cannot negotiate for basic respect. True empowerment arrives when you stop exhausting yourself trying to earn conditional approval. Creating a life where you are entirely self-sufficient, both financially and emotionally, is your ultimate armor against manipulation. It allows you to define success on your own terms, building a life around genuine passion rather than forced obligation. Letting go of toxic relatives is not an act of cruelty. It is a necessary act of profound self-preservation. When the people who are supposed to support you refuse to make room for your authentic self, your most triumphant move is to stop fighting for a seat at their table. When others will not make space for you, Sometimes you need to create your own. Healing begins the moment you realize that true family is defined not by obligation or appearances, but by love, respect, and making space for each other. What boundary will you set today to start building a life where your presence is genuinely valued